Chapter 1. It was on Sunday, May 24, 1863 that my uncle, Professor Lidenbrock, came rushing, suddenly, back to his little house in the old part of Hamburg. No, 19 Königstrasse. Our good Martha could not but think she was very much behindhand with the dinner, for the pot was scarcely beginning to simmer, and I said to myself, now, then we'll have a fine outcry if my uncle is hungry, for he is the most impatient of mortals, Mr. Lidenbrock. Already, cried the poor woman in dismay, half opening the dining room door. Yes, Martha, but of course dinner can't be ready yet, for it is not 2 o'clock. It has only just struck the half hour by St. Michael's. Well, what brings Mr. Lidenbrock home then? He'll probably tell us that himself. Here he comes, I'll be off. Mr. Axel, you must make him listen to reason. And forthwith she affected a safe retreat to her culinary laboratory. I was left alone, but not feeling equal to the task of making the most irascible of professors listen to reason, was about to escape to my own little room upstairs when the street door creaked on its hinges, and the wooden stairs cracked beneath a hurried tread, and the master of the house came in and bolted across the dining room, straight into his study. But rapid as his flight was, he managed to fling his nutcracker-headed stick into a corner, and his wide-brimmed, rough hat on the table, and to shout out to his nephew Axel, "Follow me." Before I had time to stir, he called out again, in the most impatient tone imaginable, "What, not here yet?" In an instant I was on my feet. Then in the study of my dreadful master, Otto Lidenbrock was not a bad man. I grant that willingly, but unless he mightily changes, he will live and die a terrible original. He was professor in the Johanneum and gave the course of lectures on mineralogy, during which he regularly put himself into a passion. Once or twice, not that he troubled himself much about the acid duty of his pupils, or the amount of attention they paid to his lessons, or their corresponding success. These points gave him no concern. He taught subjectively, to use a German philosophical expression, for himself and not for others. He was a selfish save on a well of science, and nothing could be drawn up from it without the grinding noise of the bullies. In a word, he was a miser. There are professors of this stamp in Germany. My uncle, unfortunately, did not enjoy great facility of pronunciation, unless he was with intimate friends, at least not when he spoke in public. And this is a deplorable defect in an orator. In his demonstrations at the Johanneum, the professor would often stop short, struggling with some obstinate word that refused to slip over his lips. They're one of those words which resist, swell out, and finally come forth in the anything but scientific shape of an oath. This put him in a great rage. Now in mineralogy there are many names, difficult to pronounce, half Greek, half Latin, barbarous appellations, which would blister the lips of a poet. I have no wish to speak ill of the science, far from it. But when one has to do with rhomboidal crystallizations, retinus feltic, resins galena, favosite malab, dates of lead, tungstates of manganese, and titanites of zircon, the most nimble tongue may be allowed to stumble. The townsfolk were aware of this pardonable infirmity of my ankles, and they took advantage of it, and were on the watch for the dangerous passages, and when he put himself in a fury, laughed at him, which was not in good taste even for Germans. His lectures were always very numerously attended, but how many of those who were most regular auditors came for anything else but to make game of the professor's grand fits of passion? I shouldn't like to say whatever my uncle might be, and I can hardly say too much. He was a true savant, though he sometimes broke his specimens by his rough handling. He had both the genius of a geologist and the eye of a neurologist. With his hammer and steel pointer and magnetic needle, his blowpipe and his flask of nitric acid, he was a master indeed by the fracture, the hardness, the fusibility, the ring, the smell of any mineral. Whatever he classed it without hesitation, among the 600 species science numbers today. The name of Lidenbrock was consequently mentioned with honor. In gymnasiums and national associations, Humphrey Davy, Humboldt, and Captains Franklin and Sabine made him a visit. When they passed through Hamburg, Beckeye Evilman, Brewster Dumas Milne, Edwards Sant, Clarice DeVille took pleasure in consulting him on the most stirring questions of chemistry, a science which was indebted to him for discoveries of considerable importance, and in 1853 a treatise on transcendent crystallography by Professor Otto Lidenbrock was published at Leipzig, a large folio with plates which did not pay its cost. However, moreover, my uncle was curator of the Museum of Mineralogy, belonging to M. Struve, the Russian ambassador, a valuable collection of European celebrity. Such, then, was the personage who summoned me so impatiently. Fancy to yourself a tall, spare man with an iron constitution and a juvenile fairness of complexion, which took off full 10 years of his 50. His large eyes rolled about incessantly. Behind his great goggles, his long thin nose resembled a knife blade. Malicious people declared it was magnetized and attracted steel filings. A pure calumny, it attracted nothing but snuff. But to speak truth, a superabundance of that. When I have added that, my uncle made mathematical strides of 3 feet at every step, and marched along with his fists firmly clenched. A sign of an impetuous temperament. You will know enough of him not to be over-anxious for his company. He lived in his little house in Königstrasse, a dwelling built partly of brick and partly of stone, with a cremated gable end, which looked onto one of those winding canals which intersect each other in the center of the oldest part of Hamburg, which happily escaped the Great Fire in 1842. The old house leaned forward slightly and bulged out towards the passers-by. The roof inclined to one side in the position. A German student belonging to the Tugendbund wears his cap. The perpendicular of the house was not quite exact, but on the whole the house stood well enough, thanks to an old elm firmly embedded in the facade, which pushed its flower buds across the window panes. In spring, my uncle was pretty rich for a German professor. The house was his own and all its belongings. These belongings were his godchild Gräuben, a Fierland girl 17 years old, his servant Martha, and myself. In my double quality of nephew and orphan, I became his assistant in his experiments. I must confess, I have a great appetite for geological science. The blood of a mineralogist flows in my veins, and I never grow weary. In the society of my beloved stones, on the whole, it was possible to live happily in this little house in Königstrasse, notwithstanding the impatience of the owner. For though he had a rough fashion of showing it, he loved me for all that. But the fact was he was a man who could not wait, and was in a greater hurry than nature when he used to plant mignonette and convolvuluses in his terracotta pots in the spring every morning. He went regularly and pulled their leaves to hasten their growth with such an original. There was no alternative but to obey, so I darted into the study immediately. Chapter 2. The study was a complete museum. Every specimen of the mineral kingdom was to be found. They're all labeled in the most perfect order, in accordance with the 3 great divisions of minerals: the inflammable, the metallic, and the lithoid. How well I knew this alphabet of mineralogical science! How many a time, instead of loitering about with boys of my own age, I amused myself by dusting these graphites, and anthracites, and pit coal, and touchstones, and the bitumens, and the resins, and organic soils, which had to be kept from the least particle of dust, and the metals from iron up to gold, the relative value of which disappeared before the absolute equality of scientific specimens, and all those stones, enough to build the little house in the Königstrasse over again, and an extra room besides, which I would have fitted up so nicely for myself. When I entered the study now, I scarcely thought of these wonders. My mind was entirely occupied with my uncle. He had buried himself in his big armchair, covered with tracked velvet, and held a book in his hands. Gazing at it with the most profound admiration. "What a book, what a book!" he exclaimed. This reminded me that Professor Lidenbrock was also given to bibliomania in his leisure moments. But an old book would have had no value in his eyes unless it could not be found anywhere else, or at all events could not be read. "What, don't you see it?" Then he went on, "It is a priceless treasure. I discovered it this morning while I was rummaging about in Heavenlands. The Jew shop magnificent," I replied with forced enthusiasm. Really, what was the good of making such a fuss about an old quarter volume, the back and sides of which seemed bound in coarse calf? A yellowish old book with a faded tassel dangling from it. However, the professor's vocabulary of adjectives was not yet exhausted. "Look," he said, asking himself questions and answering them in the same breath. "Is it handsome enough? Yes. It is first rate. And what binding? Does it open easily? Yes. It lies open at any page no matter where. And does it close well? Yes. The binding and leaves seem in one completely. Not a single breakage in this back. After 700 years of existence. Ah, this is a binding that Bavaria, Klaus and Pergold might have been proud of." And all the while he was speaking, my uncle kept opening and shutting the old book. I could not do less than ask him about the contents, though I did not feel the least interest in the subject. "And what is the title of this wonderful volume?" I asked the title of it. He replied with increased animation. "The title is Haynes Kringla by Snorre Turleson, the famous Icelandic author of the 12th century. It is the chronicle of the Norwegian princes who reigned in Iceland indeed," I said, doing my best to appear enthusiastic. "And it is translated into German." "Of course, translated," tried the professor in a sharp tone. "What should I do with the translation?" "Who cares for translations? It is the original work in Icelandic. That magnificent idiom, at once grand and simple, which allows of the most varied grammatical combinations and most numerous modification of words." "Like German," I said, making a lucky hit. "Yes," replied my uncle, shrugging his shoulders without taking into account that the Icelandic language has the 3 numbers, like the Greek, and declines proper names like the Latin does. It said, I a little roused from my indifference, and is the type good type? "Who is talking of type, you poor ignorant Axel? So you suppose this was printed, you ignorant Remus? It is a manuscript, and a runic manuscript too." "Runic? Yes. Are you going to ask me to explain that word next?" "Not if I know it," I replied in a tone of wounded vanity. But my uncle never heeded me, and went on with his instructions, telling me about things I did not care to know. The runic characters were formerly used in Iceland, and according to tradition, were invented by Odin himself. Look at them and admire them, impious young man. These types sprang from the imagination of a god. The only reply I could think of was to frustrate myself, for this sort of answer must be as pleasing to gods as to men, since it has the advantage of never embarrassing them. But before I could do this, the current of the conversation was changed, in an instant, by the sudden appearance of a dirty parchment, which slipped out of the old book and fell on the floor. My uncle pounced on this treasure with avidity. As can easily be supposed, an ancient document shut up in an old volume, perhaps from time immemorial, could not fail to be a priceless value. In his eyes, "What is this?" he exclaimed, carefully, spreading out on his table a piece of parchment, 5 inches long and 3 wide, on which some incomprehensible characters were inscribed in long, transverse lines. I give the exact facsimile, for great importance attaches to these fantastic marks, as they lead Professor Lidenbrock and his nephew to undertake the strangest expedition of the 19th century. The professor looked at the queer characters for some minutes and then pushed up. His spectacles and said it is runic. These marks are exactly like those in the manuscript of Snorre Turleson, but what can they mean? As runic appeared to me, an invention of learned men to mystify the poor world, I was not sorry to see that my uncle could not decipher it, at least. I judged so from the convulsive working of his fingers. Yet it is the ancient Icelandic, he muttered to himself. And Professor Lidenbrook could not but know this, for he was considered a veritable polyglot, not that he could speak fluently the 2,000 languages and 4,000 dialects used on the surface of the globe, but he was familiar with a good part of them. A difficulty like this, then, was sure to browse all the impetuosity of his nature, and I was just expecting a violent scene when 2 o'clock struck, and Martha opened the study door and said, "Soup is on the table. Bitch the soup to the devil and the cook too, and those who eat it." Martha fled, and I scampered after her, and hardly knowing how, found myself in my custom seat in the dining room. I waited a few minutes. The professor did not come. This was the first time to my knowledge that he had ever neglected the grave business of dinner. And what a dinner to parsley soup, a ham omelette and sorrow a la mustard aloin, a veal and a compote of plums. And for dessert crevette au sucre and all, washed down with sparkling Moselle wine. All this was what my uncle was going to lose, for the sake of an old paper really, as a devoted nephew. I felt obliged to do his share of eating, as well as my own, and I did it conscientiously. "I never saw the like of this," exclaimed our good Martha. "Mr. Lidenbrook not to come to dinner. It is incredible, this bodes something serious," went on the old servant, shaking her head. In my opinion, it boded nothing except a frightful outbreak. When my uncle found his dinner devoured, I was just finishing my last crivet when a loud, thundering summons tore me away from my voluptuous enjoyment. I made one bound into the study. "Chapter 3, it is evidently runic," said the professor, knitting his brows, "but there is a secret in it, and I will discover it or else." A violent gesture completed his sentence. "Sit down there," he had it, pointing to the table with his fist. And right, I was ready in an instant. "Now then, I am going to dictate to you each letter of our alphabet, which corresponds to one of these Icelandic characters. We shall see what that will give us. But by St. Michael, take care you make no mistake." The dictation commenced. I did my best. Every letter was called out one after another, and formed an incomprehensible succession of words. When I had finished it, my uncle snatched the paper from me and examined it attentively a long time. "What can it mean?" he repeated mechanically. On my honor, I could not tell him. Besides, he did not ask me. He was speaking to himself. It is what we call a cryptogram, where the meaning is concealed by confusing the letters designedly, and to make an intelligible sentence, they must be arranged in proper order. To think that here perhaps lies the explanation or indication of some great discovery. For my own part, I thought it was absolute nonsense, but I was wise enough to keep my opinion to myself. The professor took up the book and the parchment again, and compared them. The two writings are not done by the same hand. He said the cryptogram is of later date than the book. On the very face of it, there's an irrefragable proof of it. The first letter is a double M, which would be sought in vain in Turleson's book, but it was only added to the Icelandic alphabet in the 14th century. Consequently, there are at least 200 years between the manuscript and the document. This certainly seemed logical enough. I therefore come to the conclusion, continued by Uncle, that these mysterious characters were inscribed by someone who came into possession of the book. But who on earth was it? Could he have put his name, I wonder, in any part of the manuscript? And my uncle pushed up his spectacles and, taking a powerful magnifying glass, began to examine carefully the first pages of the book. On the back of the first leaf he discovered a spot which looked like a blot of ink. But on closer inspection, sundry letters, half obliterated, could be distinguished. My uncle saw instantly that this was the chief point of interest, and fastened on it furiously, poring over it through his big magnifying glass, till at last he made out the marks, runic characters, which he read off immediately. "Ame suk nusum," he cried in a triumphant tone. "Why, that is a name, and an Icelandic name too. That of a celebrated alchemist as Savo, who lived in the 16th century. I looked at my uncle with a feeling of admiration. "These alchemists," he went on, "have I seen a Bacon, Luli Paracelsus, were the true, the only savant of their time. They made discoveries which may well astonish us. Why should not this Saknussemm have hidden under this incomprehensible cryptogram the secret of some surprising invention? It must be so, it is." The professor's imagination was enkindled. At this hypothesis, no doubt, I ventured to reply, "But what interest could the Savo have in concealing a wonderful discovery? Why, how don't I know? Didn't Galileo act so about Saturn? Besides, we shall soon see. I will get the secret of this document. I will neither eat nor sleep till I find it out. Oh, thought I no more shall you, Axel Plague. It said I to myself, it's a good job. I've had a dinner for two today. The first thing to be done," said my uncle, "is to find the language of the cipher." I pricked up my ears at this. My uncle continued his soliloquy. "Nothing is easier in this document. There are 132 letters, in which there are 79 consonants and 53 vowels. Now, this is just about the proportion found in the words of southern languages, while the northern idioms are far richer in consonants. Consequently, this must be in a southern language." His conclusions were very just, but what language is it? It was this I waited for him to tell me, for I knew he was a profound analyst. This Saknussemm, he went on, was a learned man, and since he did not write in his mother tongue, he would be sure to employ the language in common use among the cultivated minds of the 16th century. I mean the Latin. If I am mistaken, I could try the Spanish, the French, the Italian, the Greek, the Hebrew. But the learned in the 16th century generally wrote in Latin. I may rightly then say priori. This is in Latin. I started from my recollections of Latinity, revolted against the pretension of this assemblage of uncouth words to belong to the soft tongue of Virgil. "Yes, Latin," repeated my uncle, "but tangled Latin. So be it, thought I, and if you disentangle it, my uncle, you'll be clever. Let us examine it thoroughly," he said, taking up the sheet again on which I had been writing. "Here are 132 letters in evident disorder. In some words there are nothing but consonants, as in the first moon rules. Others where the vowels on the contrary abound, the fifth, for example, untieth, or the last but one osebo. Now this arrangement has clearly not been designed. It is the mathematical result of the unknown law, which ruled the succession of these letters. It seems to me certain that the primitive phrase has been written regularly, and then turned upside down. According to some law I must find out. Anyone who had the key of the cipher could read it fluently, but where is the key? Have you got it, Axel?" I made my reply, and for a good reason. My gaze was fixed on a portrait hanging on the wall opposite me, the portrait of Gräuben, my uncle's ward, who was just now at Altona on a visit to her relations, and her absence made me very unhappy. For I may as well confess it now, the pretty Philondes and the professor's nephew loved each other with true German patience and placidity. We were betrothed, though unknown to my uncle, who was too much of a geologist to understand such sentiments. Gräuben was a charming young girl, a blonde with blue eyes, rather inclined to be grave and solemn, but loving me nonetheless. For that, for my part, I worshipped her. If there is such a word in the Teutonic language, the image of my little Philondes transported me in an instant from the world of realities to a world of fancies and memories. I could see my faithful companion in labors and past. Times every day, she helped me to put my uncle's precious collection of stones in order and put on the labels indeed. Miss Groyben was quite a mineralogist. She would have put more than one save onto the blush. She loved to dive into the deepest questions of science. What delightful hours we had spent in studying together, and how often I had envied the unconscious stones, handled by her charming hands, and when our tasks were over, how we used to go out and wander along the shady walks, by the Ulster, and then repair to the old black tarred mill, which looked so picturesque at the far end of the lake, chatting all the way and holding each other's hands. I used to tell her droll stories, which made her laugh heartily and beguiled the time, till we reached the banks of the Alba, and after saying good night to the swans, which swim about among the tall white irises, we returned to the quay of the steamboat. I had just got to this point when my daydream was rudely interrupted by a violent rap on the table from my uncle's knuckles, which recalled me to reality. "Look here," he said, "it seems to me that if one wish to mix up and confuse any sentence, the first thing he would think of would be to write the words vertically instead of horizontally in groups of 5 or 6. Indeed, thought I, we must see what that makes. Write some sentence on this bit of paper, but instead of putting the letters one after the other, put them in vertical columns, grouping them in numbers of 5 or 6. I understood what he meant, and immediately wrote from top to bottom, JET, apostrophe IME, BIEN, comma M, APPT, ITEGR, pay umlaut UBEN, exclamation mark. "I love the well, my little Groyben." "Very good," said the professor without reading it. "Now arrange these words in horizontal lines." I obeyed, and this sentence was the result. Jiminajuri, turn. "To be Maya, I ought to yipub." "Perfectly so," said my uncle, seizing the paper from my hands. "This has the look of the old document already. Vowels and consonants are grouped in the same disorder. There are even capitals in the same way, in the middle of words, and also commas, exactly as in the parchment of Supnusum." I could not but think these remarks very ingenious. "Now then," said my uncle, addressing me, "I don't know what sentence you have written, but all I need to do to enable me to read it is to take the first letter of each word in succession, and then the second, and then the third, and so on." And to his great amazement, and certainly still more to mine, my uncle read Ratanbaya my petita Groyben. "Hey, what?" said the professor positively, like a love-sick fool. I had written this telltale sentence without knowing it. "Ah, you love Groyben," resumed the professor in a thoroughly magisterial tone. "Yes, but I know," I stammered out. "Ah, you love Groyben," he repeated mechanically. Well, let us try my method with the document in question." My uncle was completely absorbed again in his subject of contemplation, and had already forgotten my important words. I say imprudent, for a savor's head cannot understand if I'll do girl, but fortunately, the great business of the document carried him away completely. Professor Lindenbrook's eyes flashed like lightning through his spectacles, and his fingers trembled as he took up the old parchment again to make his important experiment. He was greatly excited at last. He coughed violently, and in a grave tone read out the following letters, naming successively the first of each word, and then the second, and so on, as he had done in my unfortunate sentence. "Missing Carsendera ice food, OK, signature Moten, skirt. Asset Saray Rotif Sadua, Idnex dead, Sadnai La Cartney flu Siron trucks. Amutabi Led Mac Maritax Luco Islafensi." I must confess I felt excited as I ended the series. The letters themselves, named one by one, sounded perfectly meaningless, but I fully expected to hear my uncle come out in a pomper style with some magnificent piece of Latinity. But who could have thought it, instead of this, A tremendous thump of his fist sent the table spinning, jerked out the ink, and made my pen fly out of my hands. "That's not it," he thundered out. "It does not make sense." Next minute he was off like a shot, rushing down the stairs with the speed of an avalanche, and away out into the street, as fast as his legs could carry him. Chapter 4. "He is gone," cried Martha, running up to see what the noise was about. For the door closed with such a bang that it shook the house from top to bottom. "Yes," I replied, "clean gone, and without his dinner he won't have any." "No supper either," said the old domestic. "No supper either," I said. "What?" exclaimed Martha, clasping her hands. "No, my good Martha. He will neither eat any more himself, nor allow anyone else in the house to eat." "Goodness me, then there is nothing for us but starvation." I did not dare to say that with such an autocrat as my uncle. This was our inevitable fate. The old servant was evidently alarmed, however, and went back to her kitchen sighing. Now that I was alone, the thought came into my head that I would go and tell Gräuben the whole affair. But how could I get away? The professor might be back any moment. And suppose he called me and wanted to recommends his logographical labors, which old Oedipus himself would not have undertaken. And if I am not forthcoming, what would be the consequence? My wisest plan was to stay, and I had plenty to do, for a mineralogist in Bezosaw had just forwarded us a collection of silicious nodules, which had to be classified. I set to work picking out, labeling, and arranging in their glass case all these hollow stones full of small, glittering crystals. But this occupation did not engross me entirely. Strangely enough, I could not get the old document out of my mind. My brain was disturbed, and an uneasy feeling began to steal over me. I had the presentiment of some approaching catastrophe. In the course of an hour, all the stones were in their right places, and I ensconced myself in the large bell-bit easy chair, swinging myself and throwing back my head. I lighted my hooker, the carved bowl of which represented a naiad. Reclining carelessly, I amused myself with watching the progress of carbonization, which was gradually turning my naiad into a thorough negress, and kept listening for footsteps on the stair. But there was not a sound. Where could my uncle be? I fancied him striding along the road to Altana, among the beautiful trees, gesticulating and making cuts at the wall with his stick, thrashing the grass vigorously, nipping off the tops of the thistles, and disturbing the tranquility of the solitary storks. Would you come back triumphant or rejected? Would you master the secret or give it up, as I was thus questioning myself? I mechanically took up the paper on which I had written the incomprehensible series of letters, and I said, "What can this mean?" I tried to group the letters so as to form words. It was impossible, let me arrange them as I might. Putting 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 together, I could make no intelligible sense. True, the 14th, 5th, 10th, and 16th would make the English word ice, and the 83rd, 84th, and 85th would make sir, and also in the middle of the document, I noticed the Latin words rota mutabile. Ireneketra. Hang it, I said to myself. These last words certainly do go to prove my uncle is right about the language in which this document is written, and in the 4th line again, I noticed the word Luca, which means the sacred wood. On the other hand, I read in the 3rd line the word tabi led, a thoroughly Hebrew expression, and on the last the vocables mayor, arc-mayor, which are pure French. It was enough to craze 1 point for different idioms in this meaningless sentence. What connection could there be between the words ice, sir color, cruel sacred wood, cher grant mayor, arc or male? The first and the last might easily be brought together, since there was nothing astonishing in finding a sea of ice mentioned in a document written in Iceland. But for understanding the remainder of the cryptogram, that was quite another thing. I fought and fought with this insurmountable difficulty, gazing fixedly at the document till my brain grew giddy. and the letters seemed whirling around my head. A sort of hallucination came over me. I felt stifled as if from one to bear, and involuntary. Began to fan myself with the sheet of paper. The back and front of it alternately met my eye, and as it waved rapidly to and fro, I fancied I could see on the back some perfectly legible Latin words, amongst others craterum and terrestri, like broken on my mind. Instantly I caught a glimpse of the clue. I had found the key to the cipher, to understand this document. It was not even necessary to read it through the back of the page. No, just as it was exactly as he had dictated it to me. It could be spelled out easily. The professor was writing his arrangement of the letters and write about the language of the document. A mere nothing would enable him to read the whole sentence fluently. And this mere nothing chance had just revealed to me. It may be imagined how excited I was. My eyes began to swim and I could hardly see. I had spread out the paper on the table, and one glance would make me possessor of the secret. At last I managed to calm myself somewhat. I made myself walk twice around the room to quiet my nerves, and then dropped again into the capacious armchair. Now then, we'll read it, I exclaimed, taking a long breath. I leaned over the table and, placing my finger on each letter in succession, read the whole sentence aloud. But what stupefaction, what terror seized me. I sat motionless as if paralyzed. Wash, had anyone really ever done what I had just read? Had any mortal man been bold enough to make the search? But no, I cried, leaping up from my chair. My uncle shall not know. He would not be satisfied with the mere knowledge of the fact. He would undertake the journey for himself. Nothing could hinder him. Such a daring geologist as he is would start off in spite of everything, come what might, and he would drag me with him. And we should never return, never. I cannot describe my state of agitation. No, that shall never be, I said passionately. And since I can prevent my tyrant from getting such a notion into his head, I will. If he were to begin twisting and turning the document about, he might chance to discover the key. We'll destroy it. There was still a spark of fire in the grate. I snatched up both the sheet of paper and the parchment of Zakonism, and with a feverish hand was just going to fling them on the hot embers and make an entire end of the dangerous secret, when the study opened and my uncle appeared. Chapter 5. I had only just time to replace the unfortunate document on the table. Professor Lidenbrook seemed absorbed in his own meditations. His ruling thought allowed him not a moment's raspish. He had evidently been poring over the subject and analyzing it and bringing all the resources of his imagination to bear upon it during his walk, and he had come back to try some new combination. In fact, he was no sooner in than he seated himself in his armchair and, taking up his pen, began a fresh formula which resembled some algebraic calculation. My eyes followed his trembling hand. Not one of his movements escaped me. What an hopeful result was he suddenly about to produce? I trembled, and yet needlessly, for since the right combination, and the only one, had already been found, all further search must of necessity be useless. For 3 long hours, my uncle continued his labors without speaking, or even lifting his hand, blushing out and doing again, erasing and making a fresh beginning 1,000 times. I knew quite well that if you succeeded in arranging the letters in all the relative positions they could occupy, the right sentence would come out. But I also knew that 20 letters only conform to quintillions, 430 to quadrillions, 900 to trillions, 8 billions, 1,175 millions, 640,000 combinations. Now there were 132 letters in the sentence, and these 132 letters would make a number of different sentences, composed of 133 ciphers at least, a number almost impossible to enumerate or adequately conceive. I therefore reassured myself on the score of this heroic method of solving the problem. However, the time passed away and night drew on. The noisy street had become still, but my uncle still stooping down over his task, so nothing, not even his good old Martha, when she ventured to open the door partially and say, "Will you take any supper, sir?" He never heard her, and the worthy old servant had to go away. Without getting an answer, for myself I held up as long as I could, but at last weariness overpowered me completely, and I fell sound asleep on the end of the sofa, while my uncle still continued his calculations and erasures. When I woke next morning, the indefatigable worker was still at his task, his red eyes and one face and wild, disordered hair, through which he was constantly drawing, his feverish fingers, and the crimson spots on his cheeks, all told the story of a terrible struggle with the impossible. Really, he moved my pity. I could not but feel for him, much as I might justly blame him. The poor man was so completely engrossed with one idea that he forgot to put himself in a passion. All the vital powers were concentrated on one single point. Then I began to fear the long strain on them, without any escape by their usual safety valve, would positively end in some internal explosion. I could have relaxed this tension by a single gesture or word, and yet I did not still. I was acting from a kind motive. For my uncle's sake I remained silent. No. I said to myself, I won't say a word. He would want to go, then I know he would. He would risk his life to do what no other geologist has done. I'll say nothing about it. I will keep this secret chance has revealed to me. It would be the professor's death. Let him guess it if he can. I'll not have to reproach myself at any rate. With having disclosed it, my resolution taken, I crossed my arms and waited. But I was not prepared for a circumstance which occurred some hours later, when Martha went to go out as usual to market. She found the door locked. The gray key was gone. Who had taken it? My uncle must, of course, when he returned from his hasty walk the night before. But had you taken it purposely or through inadvertence? Did he really want to subject us to the horrors of starvation? This seemed to me going too far, were Martha and I to be victimized, for what did not concern us in the least. No doubt of it, for I remembered a precedent which might well frighten us some years before, when my uncle was engaged on his great mineralogical classification. He ate nothing whatever for 48 hours, and made his entire household feed on this scientific diet. I will remember the sharp twinges in my internal regions. I got through it, for such diet was not very satisfying for a boy like me, naturally inclined to be rather voracious. It certainly appeared we would have to dispense with breakfast, as we had with supper the preceding night. However, I determined to be heroic and stand out. In spite of hunger, Martha was quite distressed, and looked very grave over it. What troubled me most was that I could not get out of the house. That was a great grievance, as may easily be supposed. My uncle still labored on his imagination, was wandering in the ideal world of combinations. He lived above the earth and really above earthly. Once towards noon, the pangs of hunger made themselves seriously felt. Martha, innocently enough, had eaten up all that was left in the larder. The night before, there was nothing whatever in the house. I still stood out there. I made it a point of honor. 2 o'clock struck. The thing was becoming ridiculous and even intolerable. I began to see matters in a different light, and thought I had been exaggerating the importance of the document, that my uncle would not believe in it, that he would consider it a mere hoax, and that even if the worst came to the worst, and he wished to attempt the adventurous journey, he could be prevented by main force. And finally, I thought, he may perhaps discover the secret for himself, and I shall only get fasting for my pains. These appeared excellent reasons to me now, though the night before I had rejected them indignantly. I even thought I had been acting absurdly and waiting so long. and determined to give the solution of the mystery. Without further delay, I was just waiting for a suitable opportunity, not wishing to be too abrupt, when the professor got up and, taking his hat, was about to go out. What was I going to do? Let him leave the house and shut us all in again? Never, Uncle, I said. He did not seem to hear me. Uncle Lynbrook, I repeated in a louder tone. Hey, what? He said like a man suddenly rose from sleep. Well, have you got the key? What key? The key of the door. No, I replied. The key of the document. The professor looked at me above his spectacles, and no doubt noticed something unusual in my face, for he seized my arm sharply and, without saying a word, gazed at me inquiringly. Never was question put more plainly. I nodded my head. He shook his in a pitying sort of manner, as if he thought he had to do with a fool. I made a still more affirmative gesture. His eyes buckled and his grip became threatening. This mute conversation of ours would have interested the most indifferent spectator, and really I hardly dared to speak now, for I was afraid he would stifle me with embraces in his joy. But he became so pressing that I was forced to reply. Yes, I said. This key has by chance. What are you saying? He cried with indescribable agitation. Here, take this, I replied, handing him the piece of paper on which I had written. What you dictated, read. But there is no sense in that, he said, crushing up the paper. No, not if you begin at the beginning, but if you begin at the end. Before I had time to finish the sentence, the professor gave a cry, or rather I should say a perfect roar. A revelation had come to him. He looked transfigured. Ah, ingenious sock newsum, he exclaimed. Your phrase was written backwards then. And snatching up the sheet, he read, in tones full of emotion, the entire document. Beginning at the last letter, it was as follows, in snuffles. Yorculus craterum rem delebat umbra scoterus Juli, intracalendus descend otis verdo. At terrestrial centrum attinges, called facie anisac nusum. Bad Latin, which may be translated thus, descend the crater of the Yaku of Snare fell, that the shadow of Scarterus softly touches. Before the calends of July, vogue travela, and thou wilt reach the center of the earth, which I have done, arne sag nusum. My uncle gave a leap as he read this, as if suddenly touched by a Leyden jar. He was magnificent in his joy and daring and conviction. He went up and down the room, clasped his hands over his head, moved about the chairs, piled up the books. It seemed almost incredible, but he began to toss about his precious specimens of stones. He gave a thump with his fist here and a tap there. At last he grew calmer and sank down in his armchair, as if exhausted. What time is it? He asked. After a brief silence, 3 o'clock. I replied, stop. I have had no dinner, I'm starving. Let us go have it at once, and then afterwards. Afterwards pack my trunk. Hey, what, I cried. And your own too, added the merciless professor, as he passed into the dining room. Chapter 6. These words made me shudder, but I restrained myself and resolved to put a good face on it. Only scientific arguments would be of any avail with Professor Lidenbrook, but such arguments there were, and good ones, against the possibility of such a journey to go to the center of the earth. What fully, however, I reserved my dialectics for a fitting moment and concerned myself about dinner. It would be useless to repeat my uncle's implications. When he found a bare table, all was explained, and our worthy domestic was forthwith liberated. She hurried immediately to the market and made such successful purchases that in about an hour my hunger was appeased, and I was able to realize my situation fully. During the meal my uncle was almost merry. He even indulged in a few jokes, very harmless ones certainly. After dessert he beckoned me into his study. I obeyed. He seated himself at one end of the table, and I took the other axle. He said in a rather gentle tone, "You are a very ingenious fellow. You have done me a noble service. Just when wary of the struggle, I was about to give up the combination. What wrong track should I have got into? Then who can say I shall never forget this? My boy, and you shall have a share in the glory we are about to gain. Come, thought I, he's in a good humor. Now's the time to discuss the glory above all, continued my uncle. I am enjoining upon you the most absolute secrecy. You understand me, there are savants who are envious of me, and many would undertake this journey, who will never know of it, till we return. Do you think there are so many bold enough to venture? Certainly who would hesitate to win such fame, if this document were known? A whole army of geologists would rush after Arna, Saknussemm. That is just what I doubt, uncle, for there is no proof of the authenticity of the document. What didn't we discover it? In the book. Yes, and I grant that Sutton Newsome wrote those lines. But does it follow that he really accomplished the journey? And may not this old parchment be all a hoax? This last word was rather hazardous, and I almost regretted I had said it. The professor knitted his brows, and I was afraid I had seriously damaged my cause. Fortunately, no remark was made. A faint smile, indeed, was discernible on my stern interlocutor's lips as he replied, "That is what we shall see for ourselves," said I, "but perhaps you will allow me to exhaust my stock of objections. To the document speak your mind freely. My boy, I allow you perfect liberty of opinion. You are no longer my nephew, but my colleague. Go on then. Well, I should like to know the outset what this Yokul and Snaffle and Scartaris are. I have never heard of them before." "Well, I have no difficulty in telling you that. I happened just a short time ago to get a map from my friend, Augustus Petermann of Leipzig, and it could not have come more opportunity. Fetch the third atlas. In the second row of the large library list. G plate 4. I got up, and thanks to these precise directions, found the atlas wanted. My uncle opened it and said, "Here's one of the best maps of Iceland, Henderson's, and I dare say it will solve all our difficulties." I leaned over, and the professor said, "Look at this island composed of volcanoes, and notice that they all bear the name of Yokul. This word means Glaciras Icelandic, and in the high latitude of Iceland, most of the eruptions break out through sheets of ice. The name Yokul applies, therefore, to all the eruptive mountains in the island." "Well, and what is this Snarful?" I replied. I hoped you would not be able to answer this query, but I was mistaken. My uncle began again. "Follow me along the western side of Iceland. Do you see Reykjavik, the capital? Yes, well. Go up the innumerable fjords on the shore and stop a little below the 65 degrees of latitude. What do you see there? A sort of peninsula, like a long bare bone ending in an enormous nipan. A very good comparison, my boy. Now do you see nothing on this nipan? Yes, a mountain which seems to have risen out of the sea. Well, that is Snarfell. Snarfell, its very self. It is a mountain 5,000 feet high, one of the most remarkable in the island, and assuredly the most celebrated in the whole world, if its crater leads to the center of the globe." "But that is impossible," I exclaimed, shrugging my shoulders. "Impossible," repeated the Professor Stanley. "And pray why?" "Because the crater is evidently blocked up by lava, burning rocks, and because—" "And what if the crater is extinct?" "Extinct? Yes, the number of active volcanoes on the surface of the globe is only about 300, but extinct volcanoes are to be found in far larger numbers now. Among these last is Snaffle, and the only eruption on record took place in 1219. From that date, the rumblings began to die away gradually, till now. It is no longer ranked among the active volcanoes. To positive declarations like these, I had absolutely no reply to make. I had, therefore, to pass on to the other obscurity in the document. What does this word Scarters mean, and what are the calendars of July to do with it? I asked. My uncle took a few minutes to think, and I began to hope, but only for an instant, as he soon went on again and said, "What you call obscurity is to me light. This proves the ingenious pains Saknussemm has taken to make his discovery clear. Snarfell is composed of several craters. It was therefore necessary to indicate which one led to the center of the globe. How has the Icelandic Savon done it? He has remarked that, as the calendars of July approached, that is to say about the end of June, one of the mountain peaks, the Skataras, projects its shadow over the opening of the crater in question, and this fact he states in the document. Could anyone imagine a more exact indication, and the summit of snow fell, once reached? Could there be the least doubt which road to take? Positively, my uncle had an answer for everything I soon saw. All attack against the words of the parchment would be useless. One therefore ceased to discuss the subject and went on to the scientific objections to the journey. Well then, I said, I am obliged to confess the sentence is plain enough and leaves no doubt on the mind. I even grant that the document appears perfectly authentic. This Savon has been to the bottom of Snæfell. He has seen the shadow of Scartaris fall softly over the edges of the crater towards the columns of July. He has even heard legendary tales that this crater leads to the center of the earth. But to believe that he has reached it himself, that he ever made the journey or came back, if he did know, 100 times no, I say to that. And your reason? Said my uncle in a peculiarly bantering tone. My reason is that all the theories of science prove the impracticability of such an enterprise. All the theories say so, replied the professor good-humouredly. Aha, those tiresome theories. How they hamper us, those poor theories. I saw he was making fun of me, but I went on notwithstanding. Yes, I said, it is well known that heat increases about 1 degree in 70 feet below the Earth's surface. Now at this rate the temperature at the center must be over 20,000 degrees. Since the radius of the Earth is about 4,000 miles, everything in the interior must consequently be in an inflamed gaseous state for metals, gold or platinum, and even the hardest rocks could not resist such a heat. I'm justified, therefore, in asking if it would be possible to get there. So it is the heat then, Axel, that stumbles you undoubtedly. If we even only reach the depth of the Earth's crust, we should find the temperature was above 1,300 degrees, and you are afraid of passing into a state of fusion. I leave you to settle that question, I said crossly. This is what I settle, replied Professor Lidenbrook, mounting the high horse, that neither you nor anyone else knows anything certain that is going on in the center of the Earth, seeing that we scarcely know the 12,000th part of its radius, that science is eminently perfectible, and that each theory has constantly to give way to a fresh one. Was it not believed till Fourier's time that the temperature of the planetary spaces was constantly decreasing? And is it not known now that the greatest cold does not exceed 40 or 50 degrees below zero? Why should it not be so with the internal heat? Why should there not be a certain limit beyond which it cannot increase? I could not reply to this, since my uncle now placed the question in the regions of hypothesis. And he went on to say, and now let me tell you that many learned men, Croissant among others, have proved that if the temperature of the center of the Earth was 20,000 degrees, the incandescent gases arising from the molten materials would acquire such elasticity that the crust would burst, like a steam boiler. That is any Poisson's opinion, uncle. That's all certainly, but other distinguished geologists agree with him in thinking that the interior of the globe is neither formed of gas nor water, nor of the heaviest minerals known for. In that case, the Earth's gravity would be twice less. Oh, figures can be made to prove anything, and facts, to my boy. Is it not unquestionable that the number of volcanoes has considerably decreased since the early days of the world? And if great central heat existed, would it be likely to get less powerful if you enter the field of suppositions? Uncle, I have nothing more to say on the subject, and I have to say that my opinion is supported by that of very competent judges. Do you remember a visit to Humphrey Davy, the celebrated chemist, paid me in 1825? Not the least. Since I only came into the world 19 years afterwards, well, Humphrey Davy came to see me. In passing through Hamburg, and among other topics, we had a long discussion on the hypothesis that the center of the earth was in a liquid state. We both agreed that this liquidity was impossible, for a reason to which science can find no reply. And what is it, I asked in surprise? It is this, that the liquid mass would be subject, like the ocean, to the moon's attractions, and that consequently twice a day there would be tides, which would heave up the earth's crust and cause periodical earthquakes. But still it is evident that the face of the globe has undergone combustion at some period, and it is allowable to suppose that the exterior crust cooled first, and the heat took refuge in the center. It is erroneous, replied my uncle. The earth has been heated by the combustion of its surface, not otherwise. The surface was composed of a great quantity of metals, such as potassium and sodium, which have the property of igniting by mere contact with air and water. These metals take fire when the atmospheric vapors fall on the ground in the form of rain, and as the water gradually penetrates the cracks in the earth's crust, they cause fresh fires which burst out in explosions and eruptions. This is why volcanoes were so frequent in the early ages. That certainly is a clever hypothesis, I could not help exclaiming. And Humphrey Davy made me see it by a very simple experiment. He made a metallic ball of those metals, chiefly which I have just mentioned, which perfectly represented the globe. On this he squirted a sort of fine dust, and the surface began to puff up and get oxidized, and assume the shape of a little mountain. A crater opened in the top, and an eruption took place, which communicated such intense heat to the whole ball that it could not be held in the hand positively. I began to be shaken by the professor's arguments, heightened as their effect was by his usual fire and enthusiasm. You see, Axel, he added, geologists have raised diverse hypotheses about the Earth's center, but nothing has been less proved than the existence of great heat. According to me, it does not exist. It cannot exist, but we will go and see, and like on the sad newsum, find out for ourselves who is right. Yes, that we will, I exclaimed, carried away by his enthusiasm. We shall see, that's to say, if we can see at all there. And why not, may we not reckon on some electric light, and even on the atmosphere, for the pressure, as it approached the center, would render it luminous? Yes, it is possible. After all, it is certain, replied my uncle triumphantly. But silence, remember. Silence about the whole business. Let no one take it into his head before us to try and discover the center of the earth. Chapter 7. So ended this memorable conversation. It had put me in a perfect fever. I was quite giddy when I left my uncle's study, and there was not air enough in the streets of Hamburg. To revive me, I went along the shore of the Alba, beside the little stream which conveys passengers to the Hamburg railway station. Was I convinced by what I had been hearing, or was it merely the professor's power that had conquered me? Must I treat this project seriously? Had I been listening to the mad speculations of a fool, or the scientific deductions of a great genius? And in it all, where did the truth end and error begin? A thousand contradictory hypotheses floated before my mind, and there was nothing I could lay hold of. However, I recollected, I had felt convinced, though my enthusiasm began to cool down, but I would have liked to start immediately, before I had time for reflection. Yes, I could have strapped my portmanteau and set off that moment, but I must confess that within an hour, this unnatural excitement left me, my nervous tension relaxed, and I was able to ascend from the depths of the earth to its surface once more. It is absurd, I exclaimed. It is not common sense. It is not a rational proposal to make to a sensible lad. Nothing of the sort exists. I have not slept well, and I've had a bad dream. Meantime, I had followed the shores of the Alba and got past the town. After I came out of the harbor, I took the road to Altana in obedience to a presentiment, which after events justified, for I soon described my little Gräuben tripping along on her way home to Hamburg. Gräuben, I shouted in the distance. The girl stopped rather put about. I should imagine that hearing her name called out on the public road a few steps, and I was beside her. Axel, she said in surprise. Oh, you came to meet me. I know you did, sir. And when she looked at me, she could not but notice how upset and worried I looked. What is the matter, she said, holding out her hand. The matter, crib, in a few brief sentences told her the whole affair. She was silent for a minute. Did her heart throb like mine? I didn't know, but the hand I held in my own did not tremble in the least. We had gone 100 steps without speaking. And then she said, Axel, dear Gräuben, I replied, this will be a great journey. I gave a jump. Yes, Axel, a journey worthy of the nephew of a Savo. It is right for a man to distinguish himself by some great enterprise. What, Gräuben, wouldn't you dissuade me from attempting such an undertaking? No, dear Axel, I would gladly accompany you and your uncle, but a poor girl like me would only be an encumbrance. Is that the truth, perfect truth? Are those women and young girls? Female hearts always incomprehensible. You are either the most timid or the bravest of beings. Reason has nothing to do with you. The idea of this child encouraging me in this expedition and being willing to go herself, to even urging me to it, though she loved me, I was somewhat nettled, and why should I not own it? Ashamed as well, Gräuben, I replied. We'll see if you will say so tomorrow. Tomorrow, dear Axel, I shall say the same as today. We walked on together hand in hand, in profound silence. I felt quite worn out by the exciting scenes of the day. After all, thought I to myself, the calendars of July are a long way off yet, and many things may happen before that, which may cure my uncle's craze for an underground journey. It was late in the evening when we reached the house in Koenigstrasse. I expected to find everything quiet, and my uncle gone to bed as usual, and Martha in the dining room with her dusting brush, making all straight for the night. But I had not allowed for my uncle's impatience. I found him shouting and running about among a troop of porters who were unloading sundry goods in the passage. The old servant was at a wit's end. Come along, Axel, pray, he called out as soon as I came inside. Unfortunate fellow, here is your portmanteau not packed, and my papers not arranged, and the key of my traveling bag not to be found, and my gaiters not come. I stood dumbfounded, voice failed me. My lips could scarcely articulate the words. We're going then? Yes, unlucky boy, wondering about. Instead of being here, we're really going. I repeated feebly, yes, the day after tomorrow at dawn. I could not bear to hear more and flew to my own little room. There could be no doubt about it. My uncle had been employing his afternoon in getting some of the articles and utensils necessary for the journey. The passage was full of rope ladders, slip nooses, torches, goods, cramp irons, pickaxes, pin stocks, matrix, enough articles to load 10 men. At least, I spent a terrible night. Next morning, I heard myself called quite early. I determined not to open the door. But who could resist the soft voice which said, Axel, dear Axel? I came out of my room thinking to myself that Gräuben would change her mind when she saw my pale, haggard face and eyes red with want to sleep. But as she met me, she said, Ah, you are better today. Dear Axel, I see your night's rest has quieted you. Quieted me. I rushed to my mirror and looked at myself. Well, I must confess, I did not look so bad as I suppose. It was incredible, Axel, said Gräuben. I have been having a long talk with my guardian. He is a bold Savo, a man of great courage, and you must not forget his blood runs in your veins. He has told me all his plans and hopes, and why and how he expects to gain his object. He will succeed, I have no fear of it. Axel, it is a grand thing to devote oneself to science. What gloria awaits Mr. Lidenbrook, and will be reflected on his companion. When you come back, Axel, you will be a man and equal, free to speak, free to act, free too. The girl blushed and did not finish the sentence. Her words animated me, but I still refused to believe that we were really going away. I dragged Gräuben off with me to the professor's study. Uncle, I said, is it quite settled that we are to go? What, have you any doubt about it? No, I said, afraid of vexing him. Only I want to know what's to hurry us, so why time to be sure? Time which is fast flying and can never be overtaken. But this is only the 26th of May. And between this and the end of June, and do you suppose you ignore Ramos, that we can get to Iceland so easily? If you had not gone off like a fool, I would have taken you with me to the Copenhagen office at Liffenders & Co., where you would have learnt that there is only one service between Copenhagen and Reykjavik, and that is on the 22nd of every month. Very well, why? If we wait till June 22nd, we shall arrive too late to see the shadow of Skartaris touch the crater of Snæfell. We must therefore get to Copenhagen as quickly as we can and find out some means of transport. Go pack your portmanteau. There was not a word to say, and I went upstairs again to my room. Gräuben followed me. She undertook to arrange and stow away in a little portmanteau everything I needed for the journey. She was as cool and collected as if I had been going on a mere pleasure trip to Lübeck or Heligoland. Her little hands went quickly to work, without the least taste or fluster. She talked calmly and gave me most sensible reasons in favor of our expedition. She enchanted me, and I felt furious at leaving her. Sometimes I was going to break out in a passion, but she took no notice, and went on methodically with her tranquil occupation. At length the last strap was buckled. I went down to the ground floor. All this day philosophical instruments, arms, electrical machines were being brought to the house. Martha did not know what to make of it. Is the master mad? She said. I made an affirmative gesture. And is he going to take you with him? I repeated the affirmative gesture. Where does she ask? I pointed with my finger towards the heart of the earth. Into the cellars, cried the old domestic. No, I said, at last lower down than that. Evening came. I didn't know how the time went. Now, tomorrow morning, said my uncle. We start at 6 precisely. At 10 p.m., I fell on my bed like a lump of inert matter. During the night my fears returned in full force. I dreamt of abysses. I was delirious. I felt myself in the iron grip of the professor, being dragged away and engulfed. I was falling down terrific precipices, always getting lower and lower, with the ever-increasing velocity of bodies, falling in space, and yet I never reached the bottom. It was one interminable descent. At 5 o'clock I awoke. Exhausted with fatigue and emotion, I repaired to the dining room and found my uncle already at table, devouring all that came in his way. I almost shuddered when I looked at him, but Gräuben was there and I said nothing. I could not. At 5:30, I had the rattling of a vehicle coming down the street. It was a big coach to take us to the railway station at Altona. It was soon packed with my uncle's luggage. And where is your portmanteau? He said to me, it is ready. I replied, turning faint. Make haste and fetch you down then, or you will make us lose the train. To struggle against my fate seemed impossible. I went up to my room, rolled my portmanteau down the stairs and followed it. Immediately, my uncle was just putting the reins of government solemnly into Gräuben's hands. My pretty Philone Days retained her habitual composure and embraced her guardian passionately, but she could not keep back a tear which dropped on my face when her sweet lips touched my cheek. Gräuben, I cried. Go, dear Axel, go, she said. You are leaving your betrothed, but you will find your "Wife, when you come back." I clasped her once more in my arms, and then took my place in the coach. Martha and the young girl stood at the door, waving us a last adieu, and next minute, we were dashing along at a gallop towards Altona. Chapter 8. At Altona, which in fact was a suburb of Hamburg, commenced the line of rail to Kiel, by which we were to get to the shores of the belt. In less than 20 minutes, we entered the territory of Holstein. And at 6:30, the coach stopped before the railway station. The numerous packages of my uncle were unloaded, weighed, labeled, and deposited in the luggage van. And at 7 we took our seats opposite each other. In the same compartment, a shriek from the whistle, and we were off. Was I resigned? Not yet, however. The fresh morning air and the constant variety of scene, as the train bore us swiftly on, diverted my mind somewhat from its preoccupation, as to the professor the engine was evidently much too slow for his impatience, and his thoughts were far ahead of it. We were alone in the carriage, but neither of us spoke. My uncle was turning out his pockets and his traveling bag and investigating everything with the most minute attention. I soon saw that he had secured whatever was necessary for the execution of his projects. Among others, there was one sheet of paper bearing the heading of the Danish consulate, with the signature of M. Christensen, the consul at Hamburg and a friend of the professor. This would give us every facility for obtaining introductions at Copenhagen for the governor of Iceland. I also perceived the famous document carefully stowed away in the most secret pocket of his portfolio. I anathematized it in my deepest heart and turned away to look out again at the window, the country through which we were passing was a vast succession of uninteresting, monotonous muddy plains, though tolerably fertile. A country very favorable for making railroads, as it would allow of the straight lines surprised by railway companies. But this monotony had not time to grow wearisome, for in 3 hours from the time we started, the train stopped at Kiel, a few steps from the sea. Our luggage was registered for Copenhagen, so we did not need to trouble ourselves about it. However, the professor looked anxiously after his property as it was being carried on board the steamer till it disappeared into the hold. My uncle and his haste had calculated so well that we found a whole day would be lost here, as the steamer, the Eleanor, did not sail till night. 9 hours' fever was the result, during which the irascible traveler stormed and swore at the managers of the railways and steamers and the government, which allowed such abuses. I had to join in with him when he attacked the captain on the subject, insisting on the furnaces being lighted and the vessel put in motion immediately. The captain merely sent him about his business. But at Kiel, as everywhere else, a day must come to an end by dint of walking along the virgin shores of the bay, in the heart of which the little town is situated, and roaming through the thick woods, which give it the appearance of a nest among the branches, and admiring the villas and racing about and fuming. The time passed and 10 o'clock struck. Clouds of smoke puffed out from the Eleanor, and the bridge shook with the vibration of the boiler. When we came on board and took possession of our berths in the one solitary cabin of the steamer, at 10:15 the cable was let go, and the steamer began to thread her way rapidly through the gloomy waters of the Great Belt. The night was dark. There was a fine breeze and a strong sea, here and there on the coast. Lights glimmered farther on, I don't know where. The lighthouse shone brilliantly over the waves. And this is all I recollect about this first stage of our journey. At 7 a.m. we disembarked at Korsør, a little town on the eastern side of Zealand. Here we jumped into a fresh railway, which carried us over a country quite as flat as the plains of Holstein. We had a 3 hours journey still before reaching the capital of Denmark. My uncle had not closed an eye in his impatience, I do believe, He was pushing the carriage along with his feet. At last he caught sight of the sea in the distance. The sound he cried, on our left. There was a huge building resembling a hospital. "It is a madhouse," said one of our traveling companions. Well, now I thought to myself, that is an establishment we certainly ought to end our days in. And large as it is, it would still be too small to contain all the madness of Professor Lindbrook. At 10 in the morning we set foot in Copenhagen. The luggage was put on a conveyance, and we drove to the Phoenix Hotel in Brattergate. This occupied about half an hour, for the station was outside the town. There my uncle, after brief twilight, dragged me out with him. The portrait of the hotel spoke German and English, but the professor, being a perfect polyglot, interrogated him in good Danish, and it was in good Danish that the man directed him to the Museum of Northern Antiquities, the curator of the curious establishment, where a new history of the country might be compiled. Out of the old stone, weapons and bowls and jewels, was Professor Thompson, a savant and a friend of the consul in Hamburg. My uncle had a warm letter of recommendation to him. As a rule, one savant is not very cordial to another, but here was an exception. Mr. Thompson, being an obliging man, gave Professor Lindenbrook a hearty welcome, and his nephew also. It is hardly necessary to say that we kept our secret from the worthy curator. We were simply visiting Iceland as disinterested amateurs. Mr. Thompson placed himself entirely at our disposal and ran about the quays for us, trying to find a vessel that was going there. I fervently hoped his search would be unsuccessful, but it was nothing of the sort. A small Danish schooner, the Valkyrie, was to sail on June 2nd for Reykjavik. The captain, Mr. Bjorn, was on board. His intending passenger almost crushed his hand by the hearty grip. He gave it in his joy. The worthy man was a little astonished, for going to Iceland was an everyday occurrence to him. My uncle thought it sublime, and the brave captain took advantage of his enthusiasm to ask him double fare. But we did not look at matters too closely. "Be on board on Sunday at 7 a.m., said Mr. Bjorn, pocketing the dollars coolly. As the bargain was concluded, we then returned to the Phoenix, after giving our best thanks to Mr. Thompson for his trouble. "This is capital, most capital," repeated my uncle. "What a fortunate chance to have found a ship. Ready to sail now. We'll have breakfast and then go and look at the town." We went first to Kongens Night, or an irregular square, where the harmless cannons were posted close by. At No. 5 there was a French restauration, kept by a cook named Vassal. Here we breakfasted very well, for the modest sum of 4 marks each. Then I wandered about the town, with absolutely childish delight. My uncle walked along, but he saw nothing. Neither the magnificent palace of the king, nor the pretty bridge, built in the 16th century, which stretches across the canal in front of the museum, nor that immense cenotaph of Thorvaldsen, adorned with horrible mural paintings outside, and containing in the interior the works of the sculptor, nor the castle of Rosenberg in a tolerably fine park, a miniature structure looking like a bonbon box, nor the Exchange, a handsome Renaissance edifice, nor its tower composed of the twisted tailies of for Dragon's Inn, bronze, nor the great windmills on the ramparts, the vast sails of which swelled out before the breeze, like the canvas of a ship in a breeze. What charming walks my pretty Gräuben and I would have had along the harbor, where the 2-deckers and the frigates sleep peacefully, below the red roof of the shed and along the virgin banks of the strait, through the leafy shades of which the citadel peeps out, and its black line of cannon stretches along the branches of the elders and willows. But alas, she was far away, and might I ever hope to see her again? However, though my uncle noticed none of these enchanting views, he was much struck by the sight of a certain steeple in the island of Amak, which forms the southwest quarter of Copenhagen. I was ordered to bend my steps towards it. and hailed a little steamer, which ferried passengers over the canal. In a few minutes we landed on the quay of the dockyard after having traversed several narrow streets, where the galley slaves, in the yellow and gray short trousers, were toiling under the bat arm of the sergeants. We came in front of the 4 Frauskua Kayaka. There was nothing remarkable in this church, but this was why. The steeple had attracted the attention of the professor. It was of considerable height, and rising from the top of the tower, there was a staircase outside, which wound round the spire to the very top. "Let us go up," it said my uncle, "but it will make us giddy." All the more reason for going. We must accustom ourselves to it, but come, I tell you. Do not lose time. I was forced to obey. The man who kept the church lived on the other side of the street, and I got the key from him, and we commenced the ascent. My uncle went first with a nimble foot. I followed him in some alarm, for I was desperately inclined to turn giddy. I had neither the steadiness nor the nerves of an eagle as long as we were inside the spiral. I got on well enough, but after 150 steps, I felt the wind on my face, and we reached the platform of the steeple, where the outside stair commenced. It was protected by a frail balustrade, and the steps, growing narrower and narrower, seemed to climb up into space. "I shall never do it," I exclaimed. "Would you be a coward?" "Go on," replied the inexorable professor. I was compelled to obey, clinging with all my might. The strong wind made me giddy. I felt the steeple oscillated every gust. My legs gave way, and I had to climb up, soon on my knees, and then on my stomach. I shut my eyes. I felt sick. At last I reached the ball. My uncle, dragging me by the collar, "Look down," he said, "and look well. We must take abyss lessons." I opened my eyes. I saw the houses looking flat, and as if crushed by a fall, in the midst of thick smoke. Above my head scattered clouds were passing, and by an optical inversion, they seemed to me motionless, while the steeple and bore and myself were whirling down with fantastic swiftness. In the distance on one side lay the green plains, and on the other the sparkling sea. The sounds spread out before Elsinore, and sundry white sails like the wings of seabirds, and in the mist to the east appeared the faint outlines of the Swedish coast. All the universe was swimming round before my eyes, but for all that, I was obliged to rise and stand up and gaze. My first lesson in vertigo lasted an hour, and when at last I was allowed to descend, and my feet touched the solid pavement of the street, I was lame. "We will begin again tomorrow," said my master, and so we did for 5 days in succession. This dizzy exercise was repeated, and in spite of myself I made sensible progress in the art of high contemplation. Chapter 9. The day of departure arrived. Our obliging friend Mr. Thompson brought us hearty letters of introduction to Baron Trampa, the governor of Iceland, to Mr. Peekduyusen, the suffragan of the bishop, and Mr. Finson, mayor of Reykjavik, for which my uncle thanked him. By the heartiest shake of the hand, on the 2nd at 6 a.m. our precious luggage was carried on board the Valkyrie, and we were conducted to our narrow cabins. "By the captain, have we a fair wind?" asked my uncle. "Excellent," replied Captain Bjorn, as our wester. "We shall go out of the sound in full sail." A few minutes later the schooner got under way, and with her mizzen brigantine and taglant sail spread, was running before the breeze through the strait. An hour afterwards the capital of Denmark seemed to sink beneath the distant waves, and the Valkyrie was coasting along by Elsinore. In my excited, nervous state, I expected to see the ghost of Hamlet wandering on the legendary terrace. "Sublime madman," I said to myself, "you would approve our proceedings undoubtedly. Maybe you would follow us to the center of the globe, to seek there a solution of your internal doubt." But nothing appeared on those ancient walls. The castle, moreover, is much younger than the heroic Prince of Denmark. It is used now as a sumptuous lodge for the tollkeeper of the Sound, through which 15,000 vessels of all nations pass every year. The castle of Krunsberg soon vanished in the mist, as also the town of Helsingborg on the Swedish coast, and the schooner began to catch the breezes of the Kattegat. The Valkyrie was a good sailor, but one cannot reckon on a sailing vessel. She was loaded with coal for Reykjavik and household utensils, earthenware, woolen clothing, and a cargo of wheat. 5 men, all Danes, composed of the crew. "How long will the voyage take?" my uncle asked the captain. "About 10 days," was the reply, "if we don't get to taste of Nor'wester as we pass the Faroes. But as a rule, are you liable to be much delayed?" "No, Mr. Lidenbrock. Make your mind easy, we'll get there soon enough." Towards evening, the schooner doubled the SCA in the northern point of Denmark, and during the night, we passed through the SCA rack, coasted along the extremity of Norway, by Cape Lindness and out into the North Sea. 2 days afterwards, we sighted the coast of Scotland off Peterhead, and the Valkyrie began to steer straight towards the Faroe Islands, passing between the Orkneys and Shetlands. The waves of the Atlantic was soon dashing against our schooner, and she had to tack to avoid the north wind, and had considerable difficulty in getting to the Faroes. On the 8th, the captain sighted Myganus, the most easterly of the islands, and from that time steered a straight course for Portland Bay, situated on the southern coast of Iceland. Nothing particular occurred during the passage. I stood the sea pretty well, but my uncle, to his great vexation and still greater shame, was ill the whole time. He was unable, consequently, to have any conversation with the captain about Snarfell and the means of communication with it, or modes of transport. All these questions he was obliged to postpone till his arrival, and passed his time lying down in his cabin, the sides of which cracked and shivered with the pitching of the vessel. It must be owned he rather deserved his fate. On the 11th we sighted Cape Portland. The weather, happening to be clear just then, allowed us a glimpse of Myrdalsjökull, which rises above it. The cape is simply a low, broad hill with very steep sides, standing alone on the shore. The Valkyrie kept a good way out from the coast, in a westerly direction, sailing through numerous shells of whales and sharks. Presently an immense rock was seen, pierced with holes, through which the foaming waves dashed furiously. The Westman Islets seemed to rise out of the ocean, like rocks strewed on the liquid plain. After this, the schooner made a wide sweep to round Cape Reykjanes, which forms the western angle of Iceland. The stormy sea prevented my uncle from coming on deck to admire the broken, jagged shores, constantly beat upon by gales from the southwest. 48 hours later, just as we got out of a storm, which obliged the schooner to take in every inch of canvas, we sighted in the east the beacon light of Cape Scaon, whose dangerous rocks extend a great distance below the waves. An Iceland pilot came on board, and 3 hours afterwards, the Valkyrie moored before Reykjavik in the Fox Bay. The professor emerged from his cabin at last, a little pale and exhausted, but as enthusiastic as ever, his eyes beaming with satisfaction. The inhabitants of the town stood in a group on the quay, peculiarly interested in the arrival of a vessel which had brought everyone's commissions. My uncle was all haste to leave his floating prison, or we might say hospital, but before leaving the deck of the schooner, he dragged me away to the bow, and pointing with his finger to the mouth of the bay, showed me a high mountain with 2 peaks, a double cone covered with eternal snows. "Snarfell, Snarfell," he exclaimed. "That's reminding me," by a gesture, to keep silence. He took his seat in the boat which was waiting for us. I followed, and our feet soon touched the shores of Iceland. Next minute, a fine-looking man appeared in the uniform of a general. However, he was simply a magistrate, the governor of Iceland, Baron Rampa himself. The professor speedily discovered his rank, and presented him with his letters of introduction. From Copenhagen, then followed a brief conversation in Danish, which I did not understand a word of, and for a good reason, but the outcome of it all was that Baron Tramper placed himself entirely at the disposal of Professor Lidenbrook from the Mayor Mr. Finson, no less military in costume than the governor, and equally pacific in temper and calling. My uncle received the most kindly welcome. The bishop's suffragan Mr. Peake Torson was making an episcopal visitation in the north, so we had to give up meantime the pleasure of being introduced to him. But there was one most fascinating man we met with, whose society became very precious to Emmy. This was Mr. Fredriksson, professor of natural science in the school at Reykjavik. This modest Savile only spoke Icelandic and Latin. It was in the soft tongue of Horace that he came to offer his services, that I felt at home with them at once. In fact, he was the only person with whom I could exchange a word during my stay in Iceland. Out of the 3 rooms which his house contained, this excellent man placed 2 at our disposal, and soon we were installed in them, bag and baggage, the quantity of which rather astonished the good folks of Reykjavik. "Come now, Axel," said my uncle, "we are getting on famously. The worst part of the business is over." "How do you make that out?" I exclaimed. "Why, all we have to do now is to make the descent." "Oh well, if you look at it in that way, you were right. But we have got to get up as well as to get down. I fancy, that does not trouble me at all. Come, there is no time to lose. I'm going to the library, perhaps. There's some manuscript of Sack Newsums to be found there, and I should like very much to consult it. And while you were there, I will look over the town. Once you do that much too, that has about little interest for me. The most curious part of Iceland is not what is on the surface, but what is below. I went out and wandered at haphazard. It would have been difficult to lose one's way in Reykjavik, seeing there are but 2 streets. So I was not obliged to ask my way by making signs, which exposes one too many mistakes. The town lies between 2 hills on a somewhat low and marshy soil. An immense layer of lava covers it on one side and slopes gently down to the sea. The wide Bay of Faxa stretches out on the opposite side and is bounded by the enormous Narfell Glacier. And in this bay, the Valkyrie was the only vessel that at anchor. Generally the English and French fishery keepers are moored in the offing, but just now they were wanted on the eastern coast of the island. The longer of the 2 streets lies parallel with the shore. It is here that the merchants and traders live, in wooden huts made of red planks, laid horizontally. The other street, more to the west, runs down to a little lake, between the houses of the bishop and others not connected with trade. I had soon made my way through these dull, melancholy-looking streets, here and there catching a glimpse of a bit of faded turf, like an old threadbare carpet, or occasionally of a garden, the scanty produce of which, consisting of a few potatoes, cabbages, and lettuces, might have easily figured on a Lilliputian table. A few sickly gilly flowers were also trying to lift up their heads. In the sunlight, about the center of the non-commercial street, I found the public cemetery, enclosed by a mud wall and apparently with plenty of room in it. A few steps farther brought me to the governor's house, a hut compared with the town hall of Hamburg, though a palace beside the huts of the Icelanders. A church rose between the little lake and the town, built in the Protestant style and with calcined stones, which the volcanoes brought up from the earth at their own expense when strong gales blew from the southwest. It was evident that the red tiles of the roofs would be scattered in all directions, to the great danger of the faithful worshippers. On a neighboring eminence, I perceived the National School where, as I was subsequently informed by our host, Hebrew, English, French, and Danish are taught, for languages of which I'm ashamed to say I didn't know a single word. I should have stood at the bottom of the class. In the little college numbering 40 scholars, and being unworthy to sleep with them in one of those double closets, where more delicate boys must have died of suffocation on the very first night in 3 hours. I had gone over both the town and its environs. Its general aspect was singularly gloomy. No trees, no vegetation worth speaking of, everywhere bare volcanic rocks. The Icelandic huts are made of earth and turf, and the walls slope. Within, they resemble roofs laid on the ground. But these same roofs are meadows, comparatively fertile thanks to the internal heat. Tolerably good grass grows on them, which is carefully cut down in the hay season. For if left, the domestic animals would come and graze. On these green dwellings during my ramble, I met but few of the inhabitants. In coming back, though, along the commercial street, I saw the greater part of the population engaged in drying, salting, and loading codfish. The principal article of exploitation, the men looked robust but heavy. A species of Germans with fair hair and pensive eyes, feeling themselves a little outside the pale of humanity. Poor exiles relegated to this land of ice, who should properly have been Eskimos, since they were condemned by nature to live on the edge of the Arctic Circle. I tried in vain to catch a smile on their features. Sometimes they laughed by a sort of involuntary contraction of the muscles, but they never smiled. The costumes consisted in a coarse jacket of black woolen stuff, known as vadmail in Scandinavian countries, a wide-brimmed hat, trousers bordered with red, and a piece of leather wound round the feet for shoes. The women had sad, resigned faces, agreeable enough but without expression, and were dressed in a gown and petticoat of dark vard mail. The girls wore their hair in plaits round their heads and a little brown knitted cap over it, and the married women donned colored handkerchief with a white peak of linen on the top. When I returned to Mr. Frederickson after a good long walk, I found my uncle already in the company of his host. Chapter 10. Dinner was ready and eagerly devoured by Professor Lidenbrook, whose compulsory abstinence on board had converted his stomach into a deep gulf. About the meal itself, which was more Danish than Icelandic, there was nothing remarkable, but our host, who was more Icelandic than Danish, reminded me of the hospitable heroes of ancient times. It was evident that he considered the house ours rather than his, so long as we were his guests. The conversation was carried on in the idiom of the country, though my uncle put in a little German now and then, and Mr. Frederickson a little Latin. For my special benefit, it turned on scientific questions as befitted Saville. But Professor Lidenbrook displayed great reserve, and at every sentence warned me by a look to be careful, not to breathe a word about our plans. Almost the first question asked by Mr. Frederickson was, how my uncle had got on at the library. The library, exclaimed my uncle. Why, it only consists of a few odd volumes on a lot of empty shelves. What, said Mr. Frederickson? We have 8,000 volumes, most of them very valuable and rare, and in addition to works in the old Scandinavian tongue, we have all the novelties every year that Copenhagen can furnish us. And where are these 8,000 volumes? For my part, Mr. Lidenbrook, they are all over the country. In our ancient island of ice, there's a taste for study. Not a farmer nor a fisherman could be found who cannot read. And who does not read, we are of opinion that, instead of letting books grow moldy behind an iron greeting far from the vulgar gaze, it is better to let them wear out by being read. These volumes, therefore, circulate freely from hand to hand, and are turned over and read and reread, and often only come back to their shelves after a year or two of absence. And meantime, replied my uncle a little snappishly, strangers, what would you have? Strangers have their own libraries at home, and our first business is to educate our countrymen I say again, the love of study is in the Icelandic blood. That is how in 1816 we started a literary society, which is now flourishing. Learn it. Foreigners are proud to be members of it. It publishes books, compiled for the instruction of our fellow countrymen, and is a valuable boon to the island, if you will consent to be one of our corresponding members. Mr. Littenbrook, you will confer on us the greatest pleasure. My uncle belonged already to 100 scientific societies, but he consented with so much grace that Mr. Fredrickson was quite touched by it. And now he said, if you will please to tell me, what were the books you hope to find? I may perhaps be able to give you some information about them. I looked at my uncle. He had now to reply, for this was a question that immediately affected his project. However, after a minute's reflection, he said, Mr. Fredrickson, I wanted to know whether there are any writings of Arne Sagnusum among the ancient works. Arne Sagnusum, replied the Reykjavik professor. You mean as Savant of the 16th century, who was at once a great naturalist, a great alchemist, and a great traveler. Precisely. One of the glories of Icelandic science and literature. Exactly so, an illustrious man everywhere. That's the very man. His daring equaled his genius. I see. You know him thoroughly. My uncle's eyes beamed at this eulogy of his hero, and he listened eagerly to every word. Well, he said at last, and what about his works? Ah, his works haven't one of them what? Not in Iceland. They are neither to be found in Iceland, nor anywhere else. And why? Because Arne Sagnusum was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 his books were burnt at Copenhagen by the hands of the common executioner. Very good, that's capital, exclaimed my uncle, to the great scandal of the professor of natural science. Yes, continued by Angle. All hangs together, all is clear now, and I can understand how it was that Sagnusum, when he found himself placed on the index expurgatorius and obliged to conceal the discoveries of his genius, had to bury his secret in an incomprehensible cryptogram. What secret? asked Mr. Fredrickson sharply. A secret that which stammered out, my uncle. Is it some secret document that you have come into possession of? No, no. A mere supposition that I was making. Oh, that was it, said Mr. Fredrickson, and kindly dropped the subject. When he saw the embarrassment of his guest, I hope, he added, that you will not leave the island without having seen some of its mineralogical wealth. Certainly not, but I fear I'm a little too late. The island has already been visited by learned men, I believe. Yes, Mr. Lidenbrook, the labors of Mrs. Olafson and Povelson, undertaken by order of the king, the researchers of Troyle, the scientific mission of Mrs. Gemma and Laubert in the French corvette. The Recherche was sent out in 1835 by Admiral Dupere to find the traces of a lost expedition, that of Monsieur de Blouseville in the Eloise, which was never heard of. And lastly, the observations made by Savo on the frigate Lacan, Octus, have largely contributed to our knowledge of Iceland. But believe me, there is plenty to do yet. Who thinks so? said my uncle, carelessly trying to look unconcerned. I do. How many mountains on glaciers and volcanoes there are, about which little or nothing is known. Stop without going a step farther. Look at that mountain on the horizon. That is Snarfell. Ah, indeed, replied my uncle, that is Snarfell. Yes, one of the most curious volcanoes, and its crater has been seldom visited. Is it extinct? Yes, for the last 500 years. Well then, said my uncle, crossing his legs frantically to keep himself from giving a great jump, I should like to commence my geological explorations at this cephal of a vessel. Did you call it Snarfell? Replied the worthy Mr. Fredrickson. This part of the conversation was in Latin. I understood every word of it and could scarcely keep grave to see my uncle trying to hide his satisfaction. He was brimful and bubbling over with delight, but wanted to put on an innocent, simple look, or he managed, however, was a sort of diabolical grin. Yes, he said, What you tell me has decided me. We will attempt the ascent of Snab Fell. That right, and perhaps even study its greater. I greatly regret, replied Mr. Frederickson, that my occupations prevent me from accompanying you. It would have been most pleasant and profitable to me. Oh no, no, returned my uncle quickly. We should not like to disturb anybody. Mr. Frederickson, I thank you most heartily. Your company would have been very useful to us. But the duties of your profession, of course it pleases me to think that. In the innocent girllessness of his Icelandic nature, our host did not see through my uncle's clumsy maneuvers. I quite approve your plan, Mr. Lidenbrook, of beginning with Snarfell. He said you will reap a rich harvest there of curious observations, but now tell me, he continued, how you think of getting there by sea. The quickest way will be to go across the bay. No doubt, but it is impossible to do it. Why? Because we have not a boat in Reykjavik. Hang it, you'll have to go by land. Keeping along the shore, it is along the way. But more interesting, very good. Then I must find a guide. I just happen to know of one that will suit you. I think a reliable, intelligent man, yes, and who lives on the peninsula. He's an eider-down hunter, a very clever fellow that will please you. He speaks Danish perfectly, and when can I see him tomorrow? If you like, why not today? Because he won't be here till tomorrow. Well, it must be tomorrow then, said my uncle with a sigh. This important conversation ended a few minutes later, with heart acknowledgments from the German professor to the Icelandic professor for his great kindness. My uncle had gleaned much valuable information. During dinner he had learned the history of Saknussemm, the reason of his mysterious document, and moreover, that his host could not accompany him in his expedition. And the next day a guide will be waiting his orders. Chapter 11. In the evening, I took a short walk along the shore and came back early. I retired to rest, and was soon sleeping soundly in my big bed, made of rough planks of wood. When I woke I heard my uncle talking at a great rate. In the next room, I got up immediately and hastened to join him. He was talking in Danish to a very tall man of strong, well-built frame. This strapping fellow was evidently endowed with unusual strength. He had a very large head and an innocent, simple-looking face, his pale blue eyes, dreamy as they were, seemed to me full of intelligence. Long hair, which would have been called red even in England, hung down over his athletic shoulders. His movements were full of suppleness, but he scarcely stirred his arms, and seemed to be a man who either disdained or was unacquainted with the language of gestures. Everything about him revealed the temperament of the most perfect calmness. Not indolent but placid, you felt that he was not one to ask favors, and that he worked when it suited him, and that his philosophy would never be disturbed or surprised by whatever might happen. I could tell all this by the way the Iceland listened to the torrent of words poured out by his interlocutor. He stood with folded arms, motionless in the face of the multiplied gestures made by my uncle, his head turned from left to right. If he wished to give a negative reply, and gently bowed for an affirmative one, but so gently that his long hair scarcely moved. It was economy of motion carried to extremes. Certainly, I should never have guessed the man was a hunter. He would never frighten the game away. It was true, but how could he so much as get near it? Always explained when Mr. Frederickson informed us he was only an eider duck hunter, a bird whose down is the principal wealth of the island. The down is called eider down, and no great amount of movement is required to get it. Early in the summer the female, a pretty species of duck, builds her nest among the rocks of the fjords, which fringe the entire coast. This nest she lines with the downy feathers off her own breast. Immediately the hunter, or rather the trader, comes and takes the nest away, and the poor bird recommences her task, only to be robbed again. This is repeated till her breast is stripped bare, when the male steps in and feathers it in his turn. This time she is allowed to lay her eggs in peace, as the coarse, hard plumage of her mate has no commercial value. So the nest is completed, the eggs laid, the young ones hatched, and the birds left undisturbed till the following year, when the harvest begins again. Now as the Ida does not choose precipitous crags for her nest, but rather low-lying, horizontal rocks which stretch out into the sea, the Iceland hunter might pursue his calling. Without disturbing himself much, he was a farmer who neither needed to sow nor to cut down his harvest. All he had to do was to gather it in. This grave, phlegmatic, silent personage was named Hans Bilke. He came on the recommendation of Mr. Frederickson. This was our future guide. His manner strangely contrasted with that of my uncle. However, they soon came to a mutual understanding. Neither of them cared about terms. The one was ready to take whatever was offered, the other ready to give whatever was asked. Never was a bargain more easily settled. The result of the agreement was that Hans engaged to take us to the village of Stapi, lying on the southern side of the peninsula of Snæfell. At the very foot of the volcano, the distance by land was about 22 miles. A 2 days' journey my uncle reckoned, but when he found it in a Danish mile, there are 24,000 feet. He was obliged to alter his calculations, and taking into account the indifferent roads, allow 7 or 8 days, for horses were to be placed at our disposal, to carry him and me and to for our luggage. Hans, according to his habit, would go on foot. He knew this part of the coast perfectly, and promised to take us by the shortest route. His engagement with my uncle was not to end with our arrival. At Stapi he was to remain in his service during the whole time of his scientific expeditions, for the sum of $3 a week. It was also expressly agreed, and indeed was a sine qua non of the engagement, that the sum should be paid down every Saturday evening. The departure was fixed for June 16th. My uncle wished to pay earnest money on the conclusion of the bargain, but the man refused by pronouncing the single word, after explained the professor, for my edification. A first-rate fellow, said my uncle, has Hans withdrew, but he has no idea of the marvelous party. Has to play in the future. He will go with us then into, yes, Axel, into the center of the earth. We had 48 hours still left before starting, but to my great regret, they were obliged to be spent in preparations. We had to set all our wits to work to pack each article to the greatest advantage. Instruments on one side, arms on the other, tools in this parcel, provisions in that, for sets in all. The instruments comprised an Eigel centigrade thermometer, graduated up to 150 degrees, which seemed to me either too much or too little. Too much if the surrounding heat would rise to that, for we should be baked too little if it was to be used for measuring the temperature of springs, or any matter in a state of fusion, to a manometer, for indicating higher atmospheric pressure than that of the level of the sea. An ordinary barometer would not have been enough, as the atmospheric pressure would increase in proportion to our descent below the surface of the earth. 3. A chronometer by bus on U.S. Junior of Geneva, accurately regulated by the meridian of Hamburg. 2. Compasses for taking inclinations and declinations. 5. A night class. 6. 2. Of room corps apparatus, which by means of an electric current give a very portable, safe light. Room corps apparatus consists of a Bunsen pile set in activity by means of bichromate of potash, which has no smell. An induction coil communicates the electricity produced by the pile to a lantern of peculiar shape. In this lantern, there is a spiral tube where a vacuum has been made, and in which nothing remains but a residuum of carbonic acid gas, or of azote. When the apparatus is put in motion, this gas becomes luminous, producing a steady white light. The pile and the coil are placed in a leather bag, which the traveler carries across his shoulder. The lantern placed outside gives sufficient light in deep darkness and allows the adventurer, without fear of any explosion, to go through the most inflammable gases and is not extinguished even in the deepest waters. Mr. Ruhmkorff is a savant and clever physician. His great discovery is this induction coil, by which electricity can be produced at high pressure. He obtained in 1864 the quinquennial prize of 50,000 francs, offered by the French government for the most ingenious application of electricity. The arms consisted of 2 of Perdee Moore's rifles and 2 of Colt's revolvers. What did we need arms for? It was not likely we should encounter savages or wild beasts, I thought, but my uncle seemed to consider his arsenal as necessary as his instruments, and took special care to lay in a stock of gun cotton, which damp cannot affect, and the explosive force of which is superior to that of ordinary gunpowder. The tools comprised of pickaxes, 2 spades, a silk rope ladder, 3 iron-tipped sticks, a hatchet, a hammer, a dozen wedges and iron hold-firsts, and long knotted ropes. A pretty sized package that made for the ladder. Measured 300 feet. Then there were provisions, but these did not take up much room, though it was comforting to know we had enough essence of beef and dry biscuits to last us 6 months. The only liquid we took was gin, and absolutely not a drop of water, but we had goods, and my uncle reckoned on finding springs where we might refill them. Whatever objections to this I made, on the ground of their quality and temperature, or even their absence, was unsuccessful. To complete the exact list of all we took with us, I must mention a portable medicine chest containing blunt scissors, splints for broken limbs, a piece of unbleached linen tape, bandages and compressors, lint, a cupping glass, all terrible-looking things, and in addition to these, a series of phials containing dextrine, spirits of wine and liquid acetate of lead ether, vinegar and ammonia, all drugs suggesting painful possibilities. Lastly, all the necessary articles for Ruhmkorff's apparatus. My uncle did not forget to take a supply of tobacco powder for hunting, tinder, and a leather belt which he wore around his waist, and in which he carried a sufficient sum of money in gold, silver, and paper. Good boots, made waterproof by a solution of India rubber and nappa, 6 pairs in all, was stowed away among the tools. With such an outfit and equipment as ours, there's no reason why we should not go far, said my uncle. The 14th was entirely taken up with settling all our different articles. In the evening, we dined at Baron Trampa's with the mayor of Reykjavik and Dr. Heil Talon, the principal physician in the country. Mr. Frederickson was not among the guests. I afterwards heard that he and the governor had differed in opinion on some question of administration, and were no longer on speaking terms. I had no opportunity, therefore, of understanding a word of the conversation. During this semi-official dinner, I only noticed that my uncle was talking all the time. Next day, the 15th, our preparations were completed. Our host afforded my uncle the liveliest pleasure by presenting him with the map of Iceland, far more perfect than that of Henderson. It was the map of Olaf Nicholas Olsen, reduced to 1/180,000th of the real size of the island, and was published by the Iceland Literary Society. This was a precious document to a mineralogist. The last evening was spent in close conversation with Mr. Frederickson, for whom I felt a sympathetic attraction, and this was followed by a troubled, sleepless night, as far at least as I was concerned. At 5 a.m., the neighing of the 4 horses, as they stood pouring below the window, made me rise hastily and go down. I found Hans just finishing the loading of the horses, almost without stirring, one would say, but he did his work with uncommon cleverness. My uncle was making a great noise rather than helping, and the guide appeared to take no notice of his orders. By 6 a.m., all was ready. We shook hands with Mr. Frederickson, and my uncle thanked him most heartily for his great hospitality. As for myself, I launched out a cordial farewell, in the best Latin I could find. Then we jumped into our saddles, and Mr. Fredericks, and repeated with his last adieu that line of Virgil which seemed to have been made for uncertain travelers on the road, like us at quacum quibi dederit fortuna sequamo. Chapter 12. The sky was gloomy when we started, but settled so we had neither rain nor heat to fear. It was the very weather for tourists. The pleasure of roaming over an unknown country, on horseback, easily reconciled me to this debut of our enterprise. Indeed, I felt quite in the mood of an excursionist, rejoicing in his freedom and full of desires and expectations. I began to take my share in the business. Besides, I said to myself, what risk is there we are to travel through one of the most curious countries in the world, and to climb the most remarkable mountain, and even at the worst, descend to the bottom of an extinct crater? For it is quite evident that that is all that Saknussemm did. As to there being any passage out of it, right into the heart of the earth, that's a pure imagination, a sheer impossibility. So I shall make up my mind to get all the enjoyment I can out of this business, and not bother about the rest. By the time I had reached this conclusion, we had quite got out of Reykjavik. Hans was walking ahead at a rapid, even continuous pace. The two baggage horses followed him without being led. My uncle and I brought up the rear, and really we did not cut a bad figure on our small but stout steeds. Iceland is one of the largest islands in Europe. It is 14,000 miles in extent and has only a population of 60,000. Geographers have divided it into 4 quarters, and we had crossed in a nearly diagonal direction. The one called Sydvesturfjordunya, the country of the southwest quarter. After leaving Reykjavik, Hans kept straight along the coast. We went through scanty pastures, which tried their best to look green, and never succeeded in being anything but yellow. The rugged peaks of the trachyte rocks were faintly outlined on the misty eastern horizon, at times a few patches of snow concentrating. The scattered rays of light glittered brilliantly on the tops of the distant mountains. Certain peaks bolder than the rest pierced through the gray clouds and reappeared above the moving matter like rocks out of the sea. Often, these chains of barren rocks made a sharp turn towards the sea, encroaching on the pasturage, but there was always room enough to pass. Our horses, moreover, instinctively chose the best footing without once slackening speed. My uncle never even had the satisfaction of urging on his steed by voice or whip. He could not even get impatient with it. I could not help smiling, though, at seeing such a tall man on such a little horse. His long legs barely cleared the ground, and he looked like a centaur with 6 legs. Good beast, he said. You will see, Axel, that a more intelligent animal does not exist than the Icelandic horse. Nothing stops him, neither snows, tempests, impossible roads, nor glaciers. He's brave, steady, and sure-footed. He never makes a false step, never shies if we have to cross a river or fjord, and we shall be sure to meet with them. You will see him without the least hesitation plunge into the water as if he was some amphibious animal and gain the opposite bank. But we must not be rough with them. Leave him his liberty, and we shall get on at the rate of nearly 30 miles a day. I have no doubt we shall, but how about the guide? Oh, I have no concern on that score. Men of his stamp get over the ground without perceiving it. He moves himself too little to get fatigued. And besides, he shall have my horse at a pinch. I shall soon get the cramp. If I have no exercise, I must study my legs as well as my arms. We were getting on famously. The country was almost a desert already. Here and there, a solitary farmhouse called a bur in Icelandic, or a dwelling, construct of earth and wood and pieces of lava, stood up like a poor beggar by the roadside. These dilapidated-looking huts seemed as if asking alms from the passers-by, and for 2 pins we would have given them a trifle in this country. There are neither roads nor paths, and slow as vegetation is, travelers come so few and far between that their footsteps are soon overgrown. And yet this part of the province, lying so near the capital, was reckoned among the inhabited and cultivated portions of Iceland. What would it be then? In districts more deserted than this desert, we had gone half a mile without seeing as much as a farmer at the door of his hut, or a rude shepherd tending a flock. Less wild than himself, nothing had come in sight but a few cows and sheep wandering about as they pleased. What then must those convulsed regions be? Overturned by eruptions themselves, the offspring of volcanic explosions and subterranean commotions, we were doomed to know that in good time. But on consulting Olsen's map, I saw that they would be avoided by keeping along the winding coast. In fact, the great plutonic action, especially concentrated in the interior of the island. Then the piled-up rocks in horizontal layers, called trap in Scandinavian track heights, basalt tuff and all the volcanic conglomerates, streams of lava and porphyry in a state of fusion, invest the country with supernatural horrors. I little imagined, however, the spectacle which awaited us on the peninsula of Snarfell, where these fiery materials make a very chaos. 2 hours after leaving Reykjavik, we arrived at the Berk of Gufanis, called Old Kirkir or Principal Church. There was nothing remarkable about it. In fact, there was nothing in it but a few houses, scarcely enough to make a German hamlet. Hans stopped here half an hour. He shared our frugal breakfast and said yes or no to all my uncle's questions, except when he asked where we were to pass the night. And to this he replied Gardar. I consulted the map to see where Gardar was, and found a little town of that name, on the banks of the Kvalfjord. For miles from Reykjavik I showed it to my uncle. Only for miles, he said. For miles out of 22, that's a pretty walk certainly. He began some remark to the guide about it, but Hans took no notice and resumed his place ahead. So we had to set off again 3 hours later, still treading the faded grass. We had to go round the Katla Fjord, a shorter and easier route. Then across the inlet, we soon entered a Pinxton or parish named Aalborg, the clock of which would have struck 12 if the Icelandic churches had been rich enough to possess clocks, but they are like the parishioners. They have no clocks and manage to do without them. The horses were baited here, and then we struck into a narrow path between a chain of hills and the sea, which brought us to our next stage, the Alkirkja of Brunter, and a mile further on to Sandbuera on Exia, at Chapel Louise, on the south shore of the Kval Fjord. It was then 4 p.m. we had gone for miles, equal to 20 for English miles in this part. The fjord was at least half a mile in breadth. The waves were dashing noisily over the sharp rocks. The inlet had rocky walls on either side, or other steep precipices, and crowned with peaks to 1,000 feet high, remarkable for their brown structure, separated by beds of reddish. Tough, however intelligent our horses might be, I did not argue anything good from attempting to cross a regular arm of the sea on the back of a quadruped, if they are really as intelligent as they are said to be. I thought to myself, they won't try to pass it anyway. I'll be intelligent for them. But my uncle would not wait. He spurred right onto the shore. His horse snuffed the wind and stopped short. My uncle, who had an instinct to, urged him forwards, and again the animal refused and shook his head. Then came oaths and smart lashes with the whip, but the beast only kicked and tried to fling his rider. At last the little horse bent his knees and managed to slip out from under the professor's legs, leaving him standing upright onto boulders. Like the Colossus of Rhodes, the confounded brute, exclaimed the horseman, suddenly transformed into a pedestrian, and as much ashamed as a cavalry officer would be. "If degraded to a foot soldier, far ya," said the guide. Touching his shoulder, "What a boat dare," replied Hans, pointing to a boat. "Yes," I exclaimed. "I see a boat yonder. Why didn't you say so before then?" "Well, let us get to it, Tiavatan," said the guide. "What does he say, the tide?" replied my uncle, translating the Danish word. "No doubt he means we must wait for the tide." "For Beta," said my uncle. "Yeah," replied Hans, my uncle. Stamped his foot, and the horses went onto the boat. I quite understood the necessity of waiting for a particular state of the tide. To undertake the crossing of the field, this when the sea is at the flood. But then the flux and reflux are not sensibly felt, and there was no risk of the boat being dragged to the bottom or out into the broad ocean. The favorable moment did not arrive till 6 in the evening. Then my uncle, myself the guide, two ferrymen and the 4 horses took our places on a somewhat frail raft. A custom design was to the steamers on the Elbe, the boatman's, or seemed to me a very miserable species of propeller. It took us more than an hour to get over, but the passage was made without any accident. Half an hour afterwards, we reached the Avalkirkia of Gardar. Chapter 13. It should have been quite dark, but it was night. But under the 65th parallel, the nocturnal light of the polar regions was not astonishing. During the months of June and July, the sun never sets. The temperature, however, had gotten much lower. I was cold and were still very hungry. Welcome indeed was the bear, which hospitably opened its door to receive us. It was only a peasant's heart, but in point of hospitality equal to a king's palace. The master of it came to meet us with outstretched hand, and without further ceremony, beckoned us to follow him, literally to follow him, for to accompany him would have been impossible. A long, narrow, dark passage led into the dwelling, which was built of roughly squared planks. All the rooms opened into this passage. There were 4 in number: the kitchen, the weaving shop, the bud's sofa or sleeping room for the family, and best of all, a visitor's room. My uncle, whose height had not been considered in building the house, of course knocked his head 3 or 4 times against the projecting beams of the ceiling. We were conducted to our room, a large room with an earth floor, well beaten down, lighted by a window, the panes of which were formed of sheep splatter. None too transparent. The bed consisted of dry fodder thrown into 2 wooden frames, painted red and ornamented with sentences in Icelandic. I did not expect such comfort. The only drawback was the unpleasant smell of dried fish, hung beef, and sour milk which pervaded the house. When we had doffed our traveling attire, we had the voice of our host inviting us into the kitchen, the only place where there was a fire, even in the coldest weather. My uncle lost no time in obeying the friendly summons, and I followed. The fireplace of the kitchen was in the ancient fashion, the hearth in the center of the room, and a hole in the roof above it to let out the smoke. The kitchen also served for the dining room. On our entrance, the host, as if he had not yet seen us, greeted us with the word "Settle there too," which means "be happy," and kissed us on the cheek. Then his wife pronounced the same words, followed by the same ceremonial, and afterwards they both laid their right hand on their heart and bowed profoundly. I hasten to say that this Icelandic woman was the mother of 19 children, big and little, buzzing about the room in the midst of the dense smoke which filled it. Every instant, some little fair head and rather melancholy face would peep out of the clouds, constantly curling up from the heart. One would have said they were a band of angels, though their faces would have been the better for soap and water. My uncle and I were very kind to this brood of youngsters, so before long we had 3 or 4 of the little monkeys on our shoulders, as many on our knees, and the rest among our legs. Those who could speak repeated "Satellite whereto" in every imaginable tone, and those who could not shrieked their loudest. To make up for it, this concert was interrupted by a summons to the repast. Our hunter just at this moment came back, after seeing that the horses were provided with food. That is to say, he had, by way of economy, turned them out on the fields to find for themselves what moss they could on the rocks, and a few nutritious seaweeds, and they would return of their own accord in the morning to resume their labors sad till Verdos at hands. Then quietly, automatically, and impartially, he kissed the host and hostess and the 19 children. This performance over, we sat down to table, 24 in number, and consequently, we were literally one on the top of the other. The most favored of us had at least 2 of the small fry on our knees, but the appearance of the soup soon made silence in the little world, and the taciturnity, which was natural even among the Ghana of Iceland, resumed its way. The host assisted us to soup made of lichen, and not at all unpleasant, and this was followed by a huge piece of dried fish, swimming in butter that had been kept 20 years, and was of course perfectly rancid, a qualification which made it greatly preferable to fresh butter, according to the gastronomical ideas of Iceland. With this we had skyr, a sort of clotted milk, and biscuits, and the juice of juniper berries. Our beverage was whey mixed with water, called blunder in this country. I really am no judge of the merits of this singular diet, for I was enormously hungry, and that dessert I ate to the very last mouthful. A plate of thick buckwheat porridge. The moment the meal was over, the children disappeared, and the grown-up folks gathered around the half, when not only peach was burning, but wine's cow dung and fish bones. After this pinch of heat, the different groups retire to their respective rooms. According to custom, our hostess offered to pull off our stockings and trousers, but after most polite refusal on our part, she left us, and I was at last able to bury myself in my bed of moss. That 5 next morning, we barred the Icelandic peasant farewell, after persuading him with difficulty to take a fair remuneration, and Hans gave the signal to start. About 100 steps from Gardar, the soil began to change its aspect. The ground became boggy and less favorable to our progress. On the right, the chain of mountains extended indefinitely, like an immense system of natural fortifications, the counterscarp of which we were following. Often we came to streams, which we had to forward carefully to prevent our baggage from getting wet. If possible, the solitude deepened as we advanced, but now and again, the shadow of a human being seemed to flee away in the distance as we approached. If a sudden turn brought us unexpectedly near one of these specters, I fell back in disgust at the sight of a swollen head and shining scalp destitute of hair, and loathsome sores visible through the tattered rags that covered them. The poor wretch would not approach us, nor hold out his misshapen hand, but dart away as fast as his legs could carry him. Johannes would always manage to greet him with the usual salutation. "Saddle there to Spitulsk," he said. "Aleppo," repeated my uncle. The mere word had a repulsive effect. This dreadful disease of leprosy is pretty common in Iceland. It is not contagious but hereditary, and consequently marriage is forbidden. The poor creatures, such apparitions as these, were not calculated to enlighten the landscape, which became more gloomy at every step. The last tufts of grass had disappeared. Not a tree was to be seen except a few dwarf birches, no higher than brushwood. Not an animal except a few horses, some of which their owner could not feed, and it turned out to live as best they could. Sometimes we could describe a hawk poisoning herself in the gray clouds and then flying away to the south. Such a dreary region made me melancholy, and my thoughts began to revert to my native country. Before long, we had to cross several small and important fields, and then a wide gulf, the tide being high just then. We got over without delay and reached the hamlet of Alftanis, about 1 mile beyond. In the evening, after having folded to rivers rich in trout and pike. The Alva and the Hatter, we were obliged to pass the night in a deserted building, worthy of being haunted by all the hobgoblins in Scandinavia. Jack Frost had certainly chosen it for his own abode, and he played us pranks all night. Nothing unusual occurred. Next day there was still the same buggy soil, the same uniformity and dreary outlook. By the evening we had gone half our journey, and we spent the night at the Unexia of Cror Salt. On June 19th, for about a mile, we walked over a stream of hardened lava. This ground is called Crown in the country. The fiery surface of the lava presented the appearance of cables, sometimes stretched long, sometimes coiled up. An immense torrent of the same hardened material ran down the neighboring mountains, which were extinct volcanoes, but the ruins round attested their former power. Here and there jets of steam were still visible, issuing from hot springs beneath the surface. We had no time to observe these phenomena. We had to go on steadily soon. The buggy soil appeared afresh, intersected by little lakes. We were now pursuing a westerly direction. In fact, we had gone round the great bay of Fuxa, and the white peaks of Snar Fell stood up against the clouds less than 5 miles off. The horses held out well, undeterred by the difficulties of the soil. For my own part, one began to be very tired. My uncle was firm and upright as on the first day. I could not but admire him, even in comparison with the hunter, who looked on our journey as a mere promenade. On the Saturday, June the 20th, at 6 p.m., we reached Budira village on the seashore. Here the guide claimed his promised wage, and my uncle paid him. It was Hans' family, that is his uncle and cousins, who had offered us hospitality. We were kindly received by them, and, without abusing the hospitality of those good people, I would willingly have stayed there a little to recruit myself after our fatigues. But my uncle, who had no need to recruit himself, would not hear of it, and next morning we had to remount her steeds. The soil was plainly affected by the vicinity of the mountain, the granite foundations of which appeared above the ground like the roots of an oak. We went round the immense base of the volcano, the professor devouring it all the time with his eyes, gesticulating and apparently defying the giant and saying, "There stands the giant I am going to conquer at last." After 4 hours walking, the horses stopped of their own will before the priest's house in Staffy. Chapter 14. Stapi is a village composed of about 30 huts, built of lava and lying in the sunlight reflected by the volcano. It extends along a small field, enclosed in a basaltic war, which has the strangest effect. Basalt, as is well known, is a brown rock of igneous origin. It affects regular forms, the disposition of which is often surprising. Here nature proceeds geometrically, working after the manner of men, with square and compass and plummet, though everywhere else her art is seen in large masses, thrown down in disorder in unfinished cones, in perfect pyramids, with the most fantastic succession of lions. Here, as if to form an example of regularity, and in advance of the very earliest architects, she has created a severe order which has never been surpassed. By the splendors of Babylon and the marvels of Greece, I had heard of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland and Fingal's Cave in the Hebrides, but I had never before seen a Celtic formation. This phenomenon I was to witness at Stapi in all its beauty. The wall of the field, like all the coast of the peninsula, is composed of a succession of vertical columns, 30 feet high. These straight shafts of perfect proportions supported an architrave made of horizontal columns, the overhanging portion of which formed a semi-arch over the sea. At certain intervals under this natural shelter, there were vaulted openings of admirable design, through which the waves came dashing and foaming. Fragments of basalt torn away by the fury of the ocean lay along the ground like the ruins of an ancient temple, ruins which never grew old. over which ages passed, without leaving an imprint behind them. This was the last stage of our terrestrial journey. Hans had proved himself an intelligent guide, and it was a comfort to think he was not going to leave us here. On arriving at the door of the rector's house, just a low cabin like his neighbors, neither grande nor more comfortable, I saw a man engaged in shoeing a horse, hammer in hand, and a leather apron around him, saddle bare to said the hunter. "God dog," replied the blacksmith in pure Danish. "Kjør koherte," said Hans, turning to my uncle the rector. Said my uncle Axel, "It appears this good man is the rector." Meantime, our guide was explaining about us to the Kilkoherda, who left off his work and gave a sort of cry. No doubt in common use among horses and jockeys, a tall, vixenish-looking shrew instantly made her appearance. If she did not measure 6 feet high, she certainly was not much less. I was afraid she would offer me the Icelandic kiss, but I need not to alarm to myself, for her manner was too ungracious for any such politeness. The visitor's room to which she conducted us seemed to be the worst in the house, being close-smelling, dirty, and narrow. However, we were obliged to put up with it. The rector was clearly not given to ancient hospitality. Before the day was over, I saw we had to do with the blacksmith, a fisherman, a hunter, a carpenter, and not at all with a minister of Christ. True, we came on a weekday. Perhaps he was a better man on Sundays. I don't want to say anything bad of these poor priests, who after all, are miserably off. The sum they receive from the Danish government is ridiculously small, and all they have besides is a 1/4 part of the tithe, which does not amount to more than 60 marks, about 4 pounds. Consequently, they are obliged to work for a living. But fishing and hunting and shoeing horses gives a man at last the tone and habits and manners of fishermen and hunters and farriers and such like people. I found at night that even sobriety could not be reckoned among his virtues. My uncle quickly understood his man. Instead of a good and honorable man of learning, this was a coarse, lumpish peasant. He therefore resolved to commence his great expedition with the least possible delay, and to get out of this inhospitable passage. In utter disregard of his fatigues, he determined to go and spend a few days in the mountain. The very next morning our preparations began. Hans hired 3 Icelanders to take the place of the horses and carry our luggage, but it was distinctly understood that as soon as they had deposited it in the crater, they were to turn and go back and leave us to do the best we could. My uncle took this opportunity of uprising Hans of his intention to explore the volcano to its furthest limits. Hans simply nodded to go there or anywhere else, into the bowels of the earth or on the surface, was all alike to him. For myself, here the two, I had been amused by the incidents of the journey and been somewhat forgetful of the future. But now my terrors returned in full force. But what was to be done if I wished to resist Professor Lidenbrock? It was at Hamburg I should have done it, and not at Snarfell. One thought especially tormented me, one which might appall stouter nerves than mine. I said to myself, we are going to ascend Snarfell. That's well enough. We are going to visit the crater. Well enough too. Others have done that, and they came up alive. But that is not all. If there should actually be a passage into the bowels of the earth, and that unlucky suck news, some spoke truth, we should go and lose ourselves in the subterranean windings of the volcano. But what is that? A proof that Snarfell is extinct. Who will guarantee that an eruption is not preparing to break out? Because the monster has been sleeping since 1229, does it follow that he will never wake up again? And if he does wake up, what will become of us? This was worth thinking about, and I did think about it. I could not sleep without dreaming of eruptions, and I must say I did not feel inclined to play the part of Scoria. At last I could not bear myself any longer, and resolved to submit the case to my uncle, with as much tact as possible, and under the form of an impossible hypothesis. I went in quest of him and told him my fears, and then drew back, to let his first outburst of passion pass over. But all he said was, "I have been thinking of it." What could he mean? Was he really going to listen to the voice of reason? Could he be going to suspend his project? It was too good to be true, after a few minutes' silence, which I did not venture to interrupt. He repeated again, "I was thinking of it. Ever since we arrived here at Stoppy, my mind has been occupied with the grave question you have just submitted to me, for it would not do for us to be improved." "No, indeed," I said emphatically, "for 600 years Snarfell has been silent, but he may speak still. Eruptions are always preceded by well-known phenomena. I have been, therefore, interrogating the inhabitants of this district. On the subject, I have examined the ground, and I'm in a position to say there will be no eruption." I was amazed at this declaration and could make no reply. "To doubt what I tell you," resumed my uncle. "Well, come with me." I obeyed mechanically. The professor took a direct course away from the sun. By going through an opening in the basaltic war, soon we were in the open country, if the word can apply to an immense heap of volcanic matter. The whole region seemed to have been overwhelmed with a flood of enormous fragments of trapped basalt, granite, and all the pyroxene rocks. Here and there, I could see puffs of white vapor rising in the air. These are called by the Icelanders reg here, and issue from thermal springs, which by their violence indicate the volcanic activity of the soil. This seemed to justify my fears, but I fell from the clouds when my uncle went on to say, "You see all this smoke, Axel? Well, they prove that we have nothing to fear from the fury of the volcano." "What an idea!" I exclaimed. "Remember this," continued the professor, "at the approach of an eruption, these vapors redouble their activity, but disappear entirely while the phenomenon lasts, for the electric fluids being relieved from pressure escape by the crater instead of finding their way out through the cracks in the ground. Since then, these vapors are now in the usual state, and there is no increase of energy, and also that the wind and rain have not given way to a heavy dead calm. You may be sure no eruption is at hand, but enough. When science has spoken, it is for us to hold our peace." I went back to the passage very crestfallen. My uncle had vanquished me by scientific arguments. One hope, however, still remained, and this was that on our reaching the bottom of the crater, we should find no passage. In spite of all the suck-newsums in the world, I passed the night in all the miseries of nightmare. I was in the midst of a volcano, in the depths of the earth. I felt myself hurled into the planetary spaces in the form of ejected rock. The next day, June 22nd, Hans was ready, waiting us with his companions bearing the provisions, tools and instruments to stout sticks tipped with iron, and 2 rifles and 2 shot belts were reserved for my uncle and myself. Hans, like a wise man, had added to our baggage 11 bottles filled with water, which with our goods would be a sufficient supply for a week. It was 9 a.m. The rector and his toll shrew stood at the door of the parsonage. Doubt this. Tibet us farewell, but their idea took the shape of a tremendous bill. They charged us for everything, even to the air we breathed, and that was polluted enough. I can vouch for it, this worthy couple fleece us like any Swiss hotel keeper, and made us pay a good price for their make-believe hospitality. My uncle settled the account, however, without any higgling. A man who was just about to start for the center of the earth does not care about a few rix dollars. This matter arranged, Hans gave the signal for starting, and a few minutes afterwards we left Stabby. Chapter 15. SNAFO is 5,000 feet high. Its double cone terminates in a trachytic belt, which stands out from the mountain system of the island. From our starting point we could not see its two peaks, outlined against the gray clouds, I could only see an enormous cap of snow. Coming down low over the giant's forehead, we walked, in file preceded by the hunter, who was climbing by such narrow paths that two could not go abreast. All conversation was therefore nearly impossible. Beyond the basaltic wall of the fjord at Stabby, the ground was herbaceous fibrous peat, the remains of the ancient vegetation of the bogs on the peninsula. The quantity of this unworked combustible was enough to warm all the people in Iceland. For a century, this vast turf pit measured in certain ravines, 70 feet deep, and presented successive layers of carbonized detritus, separated by sheets of tufaceous pumice. As a true nephew of Professor Lidenbrook, and notwithstanding my mental preoccupation, I was interested in observing the mineralogical curiosities displayed in this vast cabinet of natural history, and at the same time was going over in my mind the whole geological history of Iceland. This most curious island has evidently risen from the depths of the sea at a comparatively recent epoch. Perhaps it may be even still rising by an insensible motion. If that be so, its origin can only be attributed to the action of subterranean fires, and in this case, Humphrey Davy's theory and Sark Newsom's document, and my uncle's speculations to all vanish in smoke. This hypothesis made me carefully examine the nature of the soil. I could soon account for the successive phenomena which attended its formation. Iceland, being wholly destitute of alluvial soil, is entirely composed of volcanic tufa, that is a conglomeration of stones and rocks, of a porous texture prior to the existence of volcanoes. It was composed of trapen rock, slowly upheaved from the sea by the central forces. The interior fires had not yet burst forth, but at a subsequent period, a large fissure appeared, running in a diagonal direction from southwest to northeast, by which all the trachyte gradually forced its way out. This phenomenon was not attended with any violence, but the issue was enormous, and the fused matter, thrown up from the bowels of the earth, spread slowly, and vast sheets or rounded protuberances. To this epoch the feldspars, cyanites, and porphyries belong, but thanks to this outflow, the thickness of the island increased considerably, and in consequence its powers of resistance. It can be imagined what quantities of electric fluids had accumulated within its bosom when no channel of escape presented itself. After the trachytic crust had cooled and hardened, there came then a time when the mechanical force of these gases became such that they uphived the heavy crust and made for themselves tall chimneys. The upheaval of the crust first formed the volcanoes, and then a crater suddenly opened at the summit. To the eruptive phenomena succeeded the volcanic by the newly created openings. The basaltic ejections first escaped, of which the plain we were crossing presented the most wonderful specimens. We were walking over gray rocks, which had cooled into hexagonal prisms. In the distance, a great number of truncated cones were visible, each of which had formerly been a mouth of fire. After the basaltic eruption, the volcano, which increased, and forced by the extinction of other craters, made a passage for lavas and for tufa, viz. Ashes and scoria, long streams of which I could see on the mountain sides, hanging down like flowing hair. Such was the succession of phenomena which produced Iceland, all proceeding from the internal fire, and to suppose that the mass within was not still in a state of fusion was folly, and surely to pretend to try and reach the center of the globe was the very climax of folly. I reassured myself, therefore, about the issue of this enterprise. Even while we were on our way to the assault of Snæfell, the route became more and more difficult. The ground was rising, the loose masses of rock trembled, and the utmost care was needed to prevent dangerous falls. Hans walked on as quietly as if he were on level ground. At times he would disappear behind great blocks, and for a moment we lost sight of him. Then a sharp whistle told us the direction in which to follow him. Often, too, he stopped, picked up some fragments of rock, and arranged them in a recognizable manner, making landmarks in this way all along the road, to show us the route back, a good precaution on his part. Though future events rendered it useless, 3 hours of fatiguing walking had only brought us to the base of the mountain. Their hunts made a signal to stop, and a hasty breakfast was shared among us. My uncle took 2 mouthfuls at a time to dispatch it. The quicker, but this halt was not only for breakfast, but for rest, and Hans did not make a start until 1 hour had elapsed. The 3 Icelanders, as taciturn as their comrade, never uttered a syllable and munched away with solemn gravity. Now the steep percent of snow fell, commenced his snowy summit by an optical illusion, common enough in the mountains, seemed very near, and yet what long hours it took to reach it, above all what toil, the stones not being cemented by any earth, nor adhering together by any roots of herbage, rolled away under our feet and rushed down the plain with the speed of an avalanche. In certain places, the sides of the mountain formed an angle of 36 degrees, at least with the horizon. It was impossible to climb them, and these stony cliffs had to be rounded, which was no easy matter. We had to assist each other with our sticks. I must say that my uncle kept as close to me as possible. He never let me out of his sight, and many a time his arm was my powerful support. He himself certainly had some, in a sense of equilibrium, for he never stumbled. The Icelanders, in spite of their loads, climbed with the agility of mountaineers. To look at the height of Snarfell, it seemed impossible to reach the summit, but after an hour's fatigue and athletic exercise, a sort of staircase suddenly appeared in the midst of the vast carpet of snow lying on the croup of the volcano, and this greatly simplified our ascent. It was formed of one of those torrents of stones ejected by the eruption, and which the Icelanders call Stina. If this torrent had not been arrested in its fall by the formation of the mountain sides, it would have dashed down into the sea, and new islands would have been the result. As it was, it did us good service. The steepness increased, but these stone steps helped us to climb up easily, and indeed so rapidly that when I stopped for a moment behind the rest, I perceived them already so diminished in size by distance that their appearance was microscopic. At 7 in the evening, we had gone up the 2,000 steps of the stair and risen above an extinct cone of the mountain, a sort of bed on which the actual cone of the crater rested. The sea stretched below us 3,200 feet. We had passed the limit of perpetual snow, which on account of the humidity of the climate is rather lower in Iceland. It was bitterly cold. The wind blew violently. I was exhausted. The professor saw that my legs refused to carry me, and in spite of his impatience, he determined to stop. He made a sign to the hunter to that effect, but Hans shook his head and said, "Orphan fur, we must go higher it seems," said my uncle, and asked the reason. "Mister," replied the guide. "Yeah, mister," repeated one of the Icelanders, in a terrified tone. "What does the man mean?" I asked uneasily. "Look," replied my uncle. I gazed down below. An immense column of pulverized pumice, sand and dust was rising, whirling around like a waterspout. The wind was driving it. On the side of Snæfell to which we were clinging, the thick curtain across the sun projected a great shadow on the mountain. Should this waterspout-like column bend over, it would inevitably catch us in its whirl. This phenomenon, not uncommon when the wind blows from the glaciers, is called an Icelandic mist. "Tor hastek," cried our guide, though I was unacquainted with Danish. I understood. We were to follow Hans as quickly as possible. He began to go round the cone of the crater, but diagonally to make the task easier. Before long, the huge column fell on the mountain, which trembled at the shark. The loose stones caught up in its circling eddies flew off in a shower as during an eruption. Fortunately, we had gained the opposite side and were in safety. But without this precaution on the part of our guide, our mangled bodies reduced to dust would have been carried away far into the distance and considered as the product of some unknown meteor. Hans did not think it prudent, though, to pass the night on the sides of the cone. We had to continue our zigzag ascent, the 15 feet remaining. Took us nearly 5 hours to climb the circuitous windings. The diagonal and counter marches measured 3 leagues. I'm sure I was dead beat, sinking with cold and hunger. The somewhat verified atmosphere scarcely allowed my lungs full play, but at length, at 11 p.m. in the dead of the night, the summit of Snaefell was reached, and before seeking shelter in the crater, I had time to see the midnight sun at his lowest point, gilding the sleeping island at my feet with his pale rays. Chapter 16. The supper was quickly dispatched, and the little company housed themselves as best they could. The couch was hard, the shelter rather insufficient, and the situation trying, for we were 5,000 feet above the level of the sea. But in spite of everything, my slumbers this night were particularly peaceful. It was the best sleep I had had for a long time. I did not even dream. Next morning we awoke half frozen by the keen air. The sun was shining gloriously when I rose from my granite bed and went out to enjoy the magnificent panorama that awaited my gaze. I was on the summit of one of the twin peaks of Snaefell, the southernmost. I commanded a view of almost the whole island by an optical effect common to all great elevations. The shores looked raised and the center depressed. I could have said that one of Helbisma's really Evo maps lay before me. I saw deep valleys intersecting each other in all directions. Precipices seemed mere walls. Lakes changed into ponds and rivers into little streams. On my right there were glaciers without number and innumerable peaks, over some of which there was a plume like cloud of white smoke. The undulating lines of these endless mountains, on which the snow lay like foam, reminded me of a stormy sea. If I turned to the west, there lay old ocean in all his majesty, like a continuation of these foamy summits. I could scarcely tell where the earth ended and the waters began. I was reveling in the magical delight which is awakened in the mind by all great elevations, and this time without giddiness, for at last I had become accustomed to sublime contemplations. My dazzled eyes were bathed in a flood of radiant sunshine. I forgot who I was and where I was. To live the life of elves and sylphs, imaginary beings of the Scandinavian mythology. I gave myself to the luxury of the heights, without a thought of the depths, into which I must shortly plunge. But I was recalled to reality by the appearance of the professor and Hans, who rejoined us on the summit. My uncle turned westward and pointed out to me a light vapor, a sort of mist, an appearance of land just above the waves, and said, "That's Greenland." "Greenland," I cried. "Yes. We are only 35 leagues from it, and when Thors come, the white bears find their way to Iceland. On the ice flows from the north. But that's no matter. We are on the top of Snaefell, and here are 2 peaks, the one to the south, the other to the north. Hans will tell us what the Icelanders call the one we are on at this moment." The question was put, and Hans replied, Scartaris. My uncle glanced at me triumphantly and said, "To the crater." Then the crater of Snaefell resembled an inverted cone, the orifice of which was perhaps half a league in diameter. Its depth, I estimated, was about 2,000 feet. Imagine such a reservoir full of thunders and flame. The bottom of the shaft could not measure more than 500 feet in circumference, so that the gentle slope permitted us to get down easily. I involuntarily thought of an enormous, wide-mouthed mortar, and the comparison made me shudder. To go down into a mortar, I thought, when it is perhaps loaded and may go off at any moment, is to act like fools. But I could not draw back. Hans, with an air of perfect indifference took his place at the head of the party. I followed without saying a word in order to facilitate the descent. Hans pursued a winding track. Down he was obliged to go through eruptive rocks, some of which, shaken out of their beds, rushed bounding down the abyss. Therefore awoke echoes of wonderful clearness. Certain parts of the cone-formed glaciers, Hans would then walk with extreme precaution, sounding the ground at every step with his iron-tipped stick. To discover any crevasses, doubtful parts, we were fastened together by a long rope, so that anyone who missed his footing would be supported by his companions. This arrangement was prudent, but it did not exclude all danger, however, notwithstanding all the difficulties of the descent down steeps, unknown to the guide. The journey was accomplished without any accident, except the loss of a coil of rope, which fell from the hand of one of the Icelanders, and took the quickest road to the bottom of the gulf. At midday we reached it. I looked up and saw the upper orifice of the cone, framing a bit of sky much reduced in size, but almost perfectly round. Just on the edge appeared the sunny peak of Scartaris, which lost itself in immensity at the bottom of the crater, with 3 chimneys out of which in its eruptions the central fire of Snarfell had belched out smoke and lava. Each of these chimneys had a diameter of about 100 feet. They gaped at us with wide-open mouths. I had not the courage to look at them, but Professor Lidenbrook had made a rapid survey of all 3. He was quite panting, rushing from one to another, gesticulating and talking incoherently. Hans and his companions, seated on blocks of lava, looked wonderingly at this procedure, and evidently thought him mad. All at once my uncle gave a cry. I thought he had lost his footing and was falling into one of the holes, but no, there he was, with outstretched arms and legs wide apart, standing in front of a granite rock, laid in the center of the crater, like an enormous pedestal, ready to receive a statue of Pluto. He was in the posture of a man who is stupidified, but whose stupefaction will soon give place to the wildest delights. Axel, Axel, he cried, come. Come. I ran to him. Neither Hans nor his companions moved. Look, said the professor, and, sharing at least his stupefaction, if not his joy, I read on the western face of the block, in runic characters half eaten away by time, the thrice accursed name Arni Saknussemm. Cried my uncle, do you still doubt? I made no reply, but went back to my seat in consternation. This evidence crushed me. How long I sat lost in my own reflections, I cannot say. All I know is that when I looked up again, only Hans and my uncle were in the crater. The Icelanders had taken their leave, and were now on their way down the side of Snar, fell back to Stuppy. Hans was sleeping quietly at the foot of a rock, in a stream of lava, where he had improvised a bed for himself. My uncle was pacing about, like a wild beast in a trapper's pit. I had neither the wish nor the power to rise, and following the guide's example, I fell into a troubled sleep, fancying I could hear the noises and feel the tremblings of the mountain. Thus passed the first night in the bottom of the crater. Next day a gray, gloomy, heavy sky overshadowed the mouth of the cone. I did not know it so much by the obscurity of the gulf as by my uncle's rage over it. I understood the reason, and a ray of hope dawned on me. This was why, of the 3 routes open to us, only one had been followed by Saknussemm, and according to the learned Icelander, it was to be recognized by the particular fact mentioned in the cryptogram, that the shadow of Scartaris would come and fall softly over the edge of it. During the last days of June, that sharp peak might in fact be considered as the gnomon or pin of an immense sundial, whose shadow on a given day would point out the road to the Earth's center. Now no sun, no shadow, and consequently no indication. It was June 25th now, and should the sky remain overcast for days longer, our observations would have to be deferred till another year. I cannot attempt to depict the wrath of Professor Lindbrook. The day passed and no shadow appeared. Hans never stirred, though he must have asked himself what we were waiting for, if indeed he could ask himself anything at all. My uncle never once addressed me, but kept his eyes fixed on the gloomy sky. On the 26th there was still nothing. Rain mingled with snow kept falling all day long. Hans made a heart of pieces of lava. I rather enjoyed watching the thousands of cascades that came rushing down the sides of the cone, the deafening noise increasing at every stone they came against. My uncle was beside himself with passion, and certainly it was enough to irritate a far more patient man than he. It was like foundering within sight of the harbor. But heaven never sends great sorrow without great joy, and there was satisfaction in store for Professor Littenbrook. To compensate for his agonizing suspense, the next day was again overcast. But on Sunday, June 28th, the last day but 2 of the month, with the change of moon came the change of weather. The sun poured a flood of rays into the crater. Every hillock, each rock and stone, every projection had its share in this affluence of light, and threw its shadow. Forthwith on the ground amongst the others was the shadow of Skarders, which lay like a sharp peak, and it began to move round insensibly with the radiant orb. My uncle moved with it. At noon, when it was at its least, it fell softly on the edge of the middle chimney. "It is there," exclaimed the professor, adding in Danish, "Now let's away to the center of the globe." I looked at Hans, for root was his quiet reply. Forward returned my uncle. It was 13 minutes past 1. Chapter 17. The real journey now commenced here. The two. Our fatigues had been more than our difficulties, but now the latter would multiply at every step. I had not yet even looked down the bottomless well, in which I was about to be engulfed. The moment had come. I must now take my part in the enterprise, or refuse the risk. But I was ashamed to draw back before the hunter, and Hans accepted the adventure so coolly, with such indifference, and such a perfect disregard of danger. But I blushed at the idea of being less brave than he. Had we been alone, I should have renewed my arguments. But in the presence of the guide, I kept silent. Memory recalled for an instant my pretty Fearlanders, and I approached the central chimney. I've already said that it measured 100 feet in diameter, and 300 feet in circumference, holding on by a jutting rock. I looked down into it. My hair stood on end. The feeling of vacuity took possession of my being. I felt my center of gravity becoming displaced, and my head began to reel as if I were intoxicated. There's nothing stranger than this abyss attraction. I was about to fall in, when a powerful hand held me back. It was that of Hans. Evidently, I had not taken enough abyss lessons at the Frelses Kirk in Copenhagen, but short as my survey had been of this well, I had a good idea of its conformation. Its walls, which were nearly perpendicular, were thick with sharp projections, which would greatly facilitate descent. But if the staircase was there, the rail was wanting. A rope fastened to the edge of the orifice would have been sufficient support, but how could it be? Unfasten it when we reached the lower extremity. My uncle employed a very simple method to obviate this great difficulty. He undid a coil of rope about the thickness of a finger, and for 100 feet long, he let half of it slip down first. Then he rolled it round a block of lava, which jutted out, and threw down the other half. Each of us could then descend by holding both lines of rope in his hand, which could not get loose when he had gone to 100 feet. Nothing could be easier than to hold a rope in. By pulling one end, then the exercise would begin again, and go on ad infinitum. "Now," said my uncle, after these preparations were completed, "let's see about the luggage. We will divide it into 3 parts, and each of us will strap one on his back. Of course, I mean only fragile articles." The daring man evidently did not include us in the category. Hansi said, will take charge of the tools and a portion of the provisions. You, Axel, will take another third of the provisions and the arms. And I will take the rest of the provisions and the delicate instruments. But who is to take the clothes, said I, and that heap of ropes and ladders? They will take care of themselves, how you'll see. My uncle liked to employ grand means. He ordered Hans to make a bundle of all the non-fragile articles, which was then firmly roped and thrown right down into the abyss. I could hear the loud, roaring noise it made in whizzing through the air, and my uncle stooped down and watched its progress till it was out of sight. Then my uncle said, "That's all right now, it is our turn." I ask any sane man if it was possible to hear these words. Without a shudder, the professor forthwith fastened the package of instruments on his back, and Hans took the tools and I the arms. The descent commenced in the following order. Hans first, then my uncle, then myself. It was made in complete silence, only broken by the fall of fragments of rock into the abyss. I let myself drop as it were, frantically clutching the double cord in one hand and propping myself with my stick with the other. One idea possessed me. I was afraid the support would give way. The cord seemed to me so frail to bear the weight of 3 persons. I hung up on it as little as possible, performing wonderful feats of equilibrium upon the projections of lava, which my feet sought to catch hold of like a hand. Whenever one of these slipping steps shook beneath Hans's foot, he said in his quiet voice, "G fucked attention," repeated my ankle. In about half an hour, we found ourselves on the slab of a rock that was firmly embedded in the wall of the chimney. Hans pulled the rope by one end, and the other rose in the air. After passing the upper rock, it fell down again, and a shower of stones and lava came rattling after it, like rain or dangerous hail rather, leaning down over the edge of our narrow plateau. I noticed at the bottom of the hole was still invisible. Then the rope maneuver began again, and half an hour afterwards, we had gone another 200 feet. I don't know whether the maddest geologist would have attempted to study, during his descent, the nature of the rocks through which he passed. For my own part, I didn't trouble myself about it. I didn't care whether they were Pliocene, Miocene, Eocene, Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic, Permian, Carboniferous, Devonian, Silurian, or primitive, but no doubt the professor was taking observations or making notes. For he said to me, "The farther I go, the more confident I feel. The disposition of these volcanic formations strongly supports the theory of Humphrey Davy. We are now among the primitive rocks on which the chemical operation took place, produced by the contact of metals with air and water. I reject absolutely the theory of a central heat. However, we shall soon see." Always the same conclusion. I was not inclined to amuse myself by arguing, and you took my silence for agreement. The descent began afresh, but at the end of 3 hours, I could not yet catch a glimpse of the bottom. When I looked up, I perceived the orifice narrowing sensibly. The sides seemed to approach each other, and it was gradually getting dark. Still we went on down, down. I fancied the loosened stones fell quicker to the bottom, and with more noise. I had taken care to keep an exact account of our maneuvers with the ropes, so that I knew exactly the depth attained, and the time elapsed. Each descent occupied half an hour, and we had made 14. I calculated then that we had been 7 hours and 3 hours and a half extra for rest and meals, as we had allowed us a quarter of an hour between each maneuver. Altogether 10 hours and a half. We had started at 1, it must therefore now be 11. As to the depth, 14*200 feet gave a depth of 2,800 feet. At this moment I heard the voice of Hans calling halt. I stopped instantly, just in time to keep my feet from knocking my uncle's head. "We are there," he cried. "Where?" said I, slipping down beside him. "At the bottom of the perpendicular shaft. Then there is no outlet. Yes, there is a passage. I think to the right. I only caught a glimpse of it, but we shall see tomorrow. We'll stop now and then go to sleep. The darkness was not yet complete. We opened the bag of provisions and took some food. And then we all three settled ourselves for the night, as comfortably as we could, on the stones and fragments of lava. As I lay on my back, I chanced to open my eyes and perceived a bright spot at the extremity of the tube, 3,000 feet long, transformed now into a gigantic telescope. It was a star, but deprived of all scintillation by the distance. By my reckoning, it was Beta Ursa Minor. Then I fell fast asleep. Chapter 18. At 8 next morning, a ray of daylight came to awaken us. The myriad facets on the lava walls received it and threw it back in a shower of sparks. This light was strong enough to enable us to discern surrounding objects. "Well now, Axel, what do you say to it?" cried my uncle, rubbing his hands. "Did you ever pass a quiet night in the old house in Königstrasse? No noise of carts or street cries, no boatmen's vociferations. Certainly we are quiet enough, but the very calm has something terrifying about it." Now, cried my uncle, "if you are frightened already, how will you get on by and by? We haven't gone 1 inch yet into the bowels of the earth." "What do you mean?" "I mean that we have only reached the level of the island. This long vertical tube, which opens in the crater of Sneffel, ends almost at the level of the sea." "Are you sure of that?" "Quite sure. Consult the barometer." I found the mercury, which had risen gradually, and the instrument in proportion as we descended, had stopped at 29 inches. "You see," continued the professor, "we have only yet the pressure of the atmosphere, and I am impatient for the manometer to replace the barometer. The barometer, in fact, would become useless from the moment the weight of the air should exceed the pressure at the level of the sea." "But," said I, "isn't there a reason to fear that this always increasing pressure will be very painful?" "No, we shall descend slowly, and our lungs will get accustomed to the denser air. Aeronauts end by having too little air as they rise constantly higher, and we shall have too much perhaps. But I prefer that. Don't let us lose an instant. Where's the bundle we rolled down before us?" This reminded me that we had looked for it the night before and could not find it. My uncle asked Hans about it, who, after gazing round with the keen eye of a hunter, replied, "Their hooper up there." Sure enough, there was the bundle, hanging on a rocky projection 100 feet above our head. The agile Icelander climbed up after it like a cat, and in a few minutes the bundle was in our possession again. "Now," said my uncle, "let us breakfast and eat like men who are likely to have a long day's walk before them." The biscuit and extract of beef were washed down with a drink of water mixed with a little gin. After breakfast, my uncle drew a notebook out of his pocket for observations. Then he took up his different instruments and wrote down the following result. Monday, June 29th, chronometer 8 hours, 17 minutes AM, barometer 29 feet 7 inches, thermometer 6 degrees, direction east-southeast. This last observation applied to the dim passage and was indicated by the compass. "Now, Axel," exclaimed the professor enthusiastically, "we are actually going to push our way into the heart of the earth. This is the exact time when our journey commences." So saying, my uncle took up the apparatus of Ruhmkorff, suspended from his neck with one hand, and with the other placed it in communication with the electric coil in the lantern, and immediately the light was produced, bright enough to illuminate the dark passage. Hans carried the other apparatus, which was also set in action. This ingenious application of electricity would enable us to go on for a long time, creating an artificial day, safe even in the midst of the most inflammable gases. "Forward," said my uncle. Each one resumed his load. Hans undertook to push the bundle of ropes and clothing before him along the ground, and I came behind him into the gallery. Just as I was about to enter the gloomy passage, I looked up through the distant aperture and saw, once more, the sky of Iceland, which I should never gaze upon again. At the time of the last eruption, in 1229, the lava had forced this passage for itself, and the sides of it were covered with a thick, shiny coating of it, which reflected and intensified the electric light. The great difficulty of the route was to avoid slipping too rapidly down an incline of 45 degrees. Happily, certain erosions and protuberances served for steps, which we descended, letting our luggage slip before us from the end of a long rope. But what were steps under our feet became stalactites in every other part. The lava, which was porous in certain places, was covered with small rounded blisters, crystals of opaque quartz adorned with clear drops of glass, and suspended from the roof like chandeliers, which seemed to light up as we passed. It looked as if the genii of the abyss were illuminating their palace for the reception of their terrestrial visitants. "It is magnificent," I exclaimed involuntarily. "What a sight, Uncle! Don't you admire all those shades of lava, from reddish brown to bright yellow, and those crystals looking like luminous globes?" "Ah, you like that?" Axel replied. "My uncle, you call that? Splendid. My boy, we will see many of those. I hope. Let us walk on." He would have been more correct if he had said slide, for we let ourselves slip without effort down the steep inclines. It was the faceless distensus Averni of Virgil. The compass, which I consulted frequently, indicated the southeast with undeviating regularity. This stream of lava neither turned aside to the east nor west. It had the inflexibility of the straight line. However, there was no sensible increase of heat. This supported the theories of Davy, and more than once I was astonished when I consulted the thermometer 2 hours after it only marked 10 degrees. That is to say, an increase of 4 degrees. This authorized me to suppose that our descent was more horizontal than vertical. The depth reached might have been easily ascertained, as the professor measured with exactitude the angles of deviation and inclination on the road, but he kept his observations to himself. About 8 p.m. he gave the signal to stop. Hans sat down immediately. The lamps were hung up to a judging piece of lava. We were in a sort of cavern, but the air was not deficient. Quite the contrary, certain puffs of it even reached us. What had produced them? To what atmospheric disturbance must we attribute their origin? I did not care just now to pursue the subject. However, I was too hungry and tired to argue the question. A 7 hours descent involves considerable expenditure of strength. I was exhausted and rejoiced to hear the word halt, and spread provisions for us upon a block of lava, and we all ate heartily. One thing, however, made me uneasy. Our supply of water was half consumed. My uncle reckoned on replenishing it from subterranean springs, but here the two, not even one had appeared. I could not help drawing his attention to this fact. "And are you surprised at seeing no springs?" He replied, "Most certainly, and what's more, I am very uneasy. We only have water enough for 5 days. Don't worry yourself, Axel. I'll answer for it. We shall find water, and more than we want. And when? When we get out of this lava that envelops us. How can you think springs could burst through such walls as these? But perhaps this passage runs to a great depth. It seems to me that we have not made great progress vertically." "What makes you think that?" "Because the heat would be much greater if we had penetrated very far through the crust." "According to your system," replied my uncle. "What is the thermometer?" "Scarcely 15 degrees, which shows only an increase of 9 degrees since we started." "Well, and what is your conclusion?" "This is my conclusion, according to the most exact observations. The increase of heat in the interior of the globe is 1 degree in 100 feet. But certain localities may modify this figure. For instance, at Yakwest in Siberia, the increase is 1 degree in 36 feet. This difference evidently depends on the conducting power of rocks. I may add to that, in the neighborhood of an extinct volcano. And through nice it has been observed that the elevation of the temperature was any 1 degree in 125 feet. Let us adopt this last hypothesis and calculate. Do. So my boy, nothing is easier, I said, writing down the figures in my notebook 9 times. 125 feet make 1,125 feet of depth. That's it exactly. Well then, according to my observations, we are 10,000 feet below the level of the sea. Is it possible? Yes, figures are no longer figures. The professor's calculations were exact. We had already exceeded by 6,000 feet. The greatest depth ever reached by man, such as the mines of Kitzbühel in the Tyrol and those of Württemberg in Bohemia. The temperature, which ought to have been 81 degrees, was scarcely 15 degrees. This was certainly well worth thinking over. Chapter 19. Next day, Tuesday, June the 30th at 6 a.m., and the descent was resumed. We still followed the gallery of lava, a real natural staircase, sloping as gently as those inclined planes, which are found in place of stairs, even yet in some old houses. We went on till 12:17, the exact time when we overtook Hans, who had just stopped short. "Ah," cried my uncle. "Then we have come to the end of the gallery." I looked around me. We were in crossroads. Two paths lay before us, both dark and narrow. Which should we take here was a difficulty. However, my uncle would not allow himself to show any hesitation. Before me or the guide he pointed to the eastern tunnel, and soon we were all three treading it. Besides, we might have stood, hesitating forever, for there was nothing to determine the choice. We were absolutely forced to trust to chance. The slope of this fresh gallery was scarcely perceptible and its sections very unequal. Sometimes a succession of arches would be disclosed, like the nave of a Gothic cathedral. The architect of the Middle Ages might have studied here all the forms of church architecture, which start from the ogive, a mile farther, and we had to stoop our heads beneath elliptic arches in the Roman style, then massive pillars in the war, bent beneath the abutments of the arches in other places. This arrangement gave place to low substructures, like beavers' huts, and we had to crawl along narrow tube-like passages. The heat was always bearable, but involuntary thoughts came over me of its intensity. When the lava ejected by Snar fell, rushed along by the route, which was now so quiet,